I guess we'll begin. First of all, let me thank you all for coming out tonight. This is very important. Our second public hearing, public meeting to help you deal with some of the questions, some of your concerns, some of your feelings about dissolution. Just to let you know, your village is in very good financial shape. It's well on the way. Things are going pretty well here. It's an honor to introduce Wade Beltramo. Anytime that we have an issue in the village office, or we have a concern, or we have something that we're not absolutely positive about, we call Wade. It's almost like we have a hotline to Wade's office. He's very receptive, he's very responsive. I think he's one of the best voices in terms of how the dissolution process works. He's traveled far and wide across New York State to deal with this issue, to deal with the citizens' concerns about this issue. He will stay as long as you have questions and concerns. This is your forum. So please don't walk away tonight with questions. Ask. Wade, you're all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everybody. My name is Wade Beltramo. I'm General Counsel for the New York State Conference of Mayors, also known as NICOM. We are a not-for-profit association that represents the state's city and village governments. So everybody should have a copy of this handout, which is basically every slide I'm going to go over tonight, and we'll hit all of these as we go through. The mayor said this, and I'm going to reiterate it. If at any time you have any question about anything I'm saying or about the dissolution process or local government at all, don't hesitate to ask. I would just as soon, I do have a method to my madness. I've spoken a lot on this issue and many other issues affecting local governments for that matter. But I would prefer that nobody leave here tonight with a question that I can answer. There are some questions I can't answer. There are some things that you're not going to know before you have to vote in less than 2 weeks on whether or not to dissolve the village. So, but to the extent that I can answer one of your questions, I want to do so. So don't hesitate to call or raise your hand tonight. After tonight, we are a membership organization, so we don't take calls from the public. If you have a question, you should go to your village officials and ask them a question, and if they can answer it, they can call or email me. That's one of the things we do at the Conference of Mayors, which I just want to give you a little bit of background. I mentioned we're a not-for-profit association. We provide a variety of services to local governments. We were formed over 100 years ago by city mayors who got together and said, you know what? We have issues in our community, and we need to have a voice at the Capitol in Albany to get those issues addressed, because Albany's not paying attention to our communities. So that is one of the things that NICOM does. We are lobbyists. We're advocates, I prefer. We don't donate or contribute to campaigns. We have to argue that things make sense for good public policy, which puts us at a little bit of a disadvantage in Albany. But that's one of the things we do. We also provide on a daily basis technical assistance to our members. So they can call or email us or fax us if they have a question about how the village dissolution process works, how water and sewer programs work, how to comply with the open meetings law, how to do the budget, which the mayor's in the process of developing right now, finalizing for the village, right? So there's a whole myriad of rules and regulations and laws that local officials need to know and understand and how to comply with. That's what we're here for. We're basically an efficiency. We're a form of intermunicipal government cooperation for more efficient services. We also produce a ton of publications. We have a handbook for village officials that tries to answer all the questions, or at least most of the questions that they have on a daily basis. We provide a lot of training. In addition to workshops like this, we do annual training. We have a fall training school that we put on in conjunction with the Office of the State Comptroller. It's really a week-long conference that's designed for municipal clerks and municipal finance officers to educate them on how to do their jobs, how to comply with state law. And then we also weigh in on some cases that are litigated that affect or potentially would affect our members as amicus. That's the legal term, friends of the court. So that's in a nutshell what NICOM is, but it begs the question, why am I here this evening? And the reason I'm here this evening is because on March 19th, the village residents of the Village of Champlain are going to vote on whether or not to dissolve the village. You're not the only village, actually, that's going to be voting on that issue. Also on the 19th, the Village of Victory, or sometimes referred to as Victory Mills down in Saratoga County, they will be voting on whether or not to dissolve. But this is why. Village dissolutions are not new. It is not a recent activity. I hate to burst any bubbles. You're not really being all that innovative or trailblazers here by discussing this issue. Village dissolutions have been happening, you can see here, all the way back to 1921. That's the data I have. I wouldn't be surprised if villages have dissolved before then. Villages have been dissolving and been being incorporated and created for hundreds of years, right? They exist to serve an underlying community, and to the extent that that community is formed or it goes away, so does the local government, all right? So this is why we're here. We get called all the time. As I was talking to some of the people who came early, I was on the phone for 45 minutes this afternoon with somebody from the village of Altmar, which is going to dissolve in 3 months. They're actually in the transition. They've already said they're going to do that, and they have questions about how to go through. That's what we're here for. We are a service, and I'm the point person at the Conference of Mayors on village dissolution issues. In addition to these villages that actually have decided to dissolve, there have been many, many villages that have studied it and decided not to vote on it, or have studied it and voted it down. So this is kind of a constant process, and we do see kind of an ebb and flow in villages that are studying dissolution or that actually vote on dissolution when the economy is tough, when we have recessions. We see village dissolution activity increase because municipal budgets get pinched and get tight. And of course, we're slowly coming out one of the worst recessions we've ever seen. And so there has been an increase in dissolution activity. We've also seen an increase in dissolution activity because of this. This is, while village dissolution has been going on for a long time, this law is new. It went into effect on March 21st of 2010, and you are operating under this law. By contrast, there is one village still that's considering dissolution under the old law. It's actually the same village that's voting on March 19th, the Village of Victory. They had a petition filed way back in 2009 under the old law, Village Law Article 19. It was by no means a perfect law. I think it was a better law than this one, and hopefully that'll become clear why as we go along. They actually have a plan in place. They've been studying this for 3 years, and their residents have a plan about what's going to happen should they decide to dissolve the village. All right? And that's really a major distinction between the old law that was repealed and the new law which you're voting under. This has been the activity under the new law. And you can see it went into effect, as I mentioned, on March 2010. We had a bunch of dissolution activity in the summer and fall of 2010. All of those voted it down. Waddington actually had a petition filed that was deemed invalid, and then nobody followed up. Altmar approved dissolution. This is following up there. They did a study. All these other ones then voted it down again. Altmar voted again, and I'm going to talk about this. There's the potential for having a second bite at the apple should you vote to dissolve the village on the 19th. I'll talk about the process this evening. Voted down 2 recent votes. The Village of Lyons, which is out in Wayne County near Rochester, and the Village of Keysville, just near here, right, just south of Plattsburgh. They voted recently to approve dissolution. This is a very poor percentage of dissolution votes in favor of dissolving. And I'll go upon this a little bit more later. There have been 19 votes so far, of which 17 villages have voted against. And that is if you look at the history of village dissolution votes, it's a very low rate of approval. And the reason being is because most of these villages have voted on whether or not to dissolve without having a plan or a study in place to tell them what's going to happen should the village dissolve. I think it's fair, and I try to reiterate this as we go on, that you understand where I'm coming from. We do represent cities and villages. The village of Champlain is one of our members. They pay an annual membership due to us. Do you know how much it is? I forget what it is. What? $778. They pay $778 a year to the Conference of Mayors. So people think, you know, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to be like, no, don't dissolve the Village of Champlain because my organization has a vested interest. I mean, I want to be up front. They pay an annual due to $778 to the Conference of Mayors. So I want everybody to be clear about that. No offense if you dissolve. We will be sad that you leave, but it's not going to bust the Conference of Mayors and it's not going to affect my pay. All right? What are my positions? First of all, villages are not merely multi-purpose taxing districts. Villages are general local government entities. They are municipal home rule entities that, in addition to providing services, have the ability and the sole ability of any local government entity in the state of New York to adopt rules and regulations, including land use and zoning, within the geographic boundaries of this village. Villages are not a third layer of government. This often gets bandied about. Villages are New York's form of city government. Right? We'll say, but we're not a city. There's the city of Plattsburgh. I know that. They're like 15 miles down the road. We're not a city. We're a village. What's the difference between a city and a village? Anybody? They're bigger population. How do you become a city? See, this is a problem. Our education system in New York is failing. How do you become a city? Anybody know? You have to get a charter from the state legislature. You have to go with your hat in your hand to Albany. Never a pleasant experience. I shouldn't say Albany. Mayor Jennings of Albany says, it's not Albany. Albany's a great city. It's the capital. You have to go with your hat in your hand to the capital and ask them to give you a city charter. We're editing this, right? You're going to cut that out and you're going to give me more hair too, right? Okay. Sorry. You have to get a city charter from the legislature. When was the last time the legislature gave out a city charter, created a city book? Does anybody know that? Want to hazard a guess? We're an old state. We're an historic state, the great state of New York. When was the last time we had a city created? 1904. That's a little long time ago, but you're not too bad. 50 years. 1942, the village of Rye was granted a charter and became the city of Rye. Now, this isn't for the lack of trying. Many, many villages have tried to become cities. A village not too far from here, the village of Saranac Lake, just got some money from the state to do a study. Well, that's a village in 3 towns and 2 counties. They said, this structure is not working. Let's look. Should we dissolve? No, that makes even no sense at all. You know, then we got to divide all these between these towns. Let's become a city. That really makes sense. And they went to their legislators and they said, you know what, you gave us this money to study what to do with our local government structure. This money that you gave us, the state of New York, we figured out the smartest thing to do was become a city, and the state of New York said, that's not happening. So we're left with village government. And the real distinction between a city and village, it's your Form A. Every city is governed by its charter. Most of the villages are governed by what's called the village law. You're incorporated under the village law. But the main distinction is that you're also considered part of the town. And you really consider part of the town for one purpose, one major purpose, and that is for the purpose of paying taxes. If you were a city, you would not be considered part of the town, and you would not pay town taxes. That doesn't mean you're a third layer of government. The town has no jurisdiction right now because the village exists to adopt local laws within the village. They do not regulate the village streets and roads, right? They have no ability to come in here and just say, oh, we're going to create a district, or oh, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. No, that's the jurisdiction of the village, and it's controlled by the democratically elected board of trustees and mayor that only the village residents get to vote for, okay? So what's the third thing? I've already mentioned this, New York's form of incorporated city governments. It's NICOM's position and my position that residents should have the ability to petition to create and dissolve village governments. We are not opposed to that process. I object to the current law because I think it has major deficiencies, but I'm not opposed to the concept that village residents should be able to petition to create or dissolve villages. And in fact, and this is one of the important things, villages are the most democratic form of local government in the state of New York because they are the only form of local government which can be created or dissolved by petition of the residents. You cannot dissolve towns. They're not allowed to be dissolved by state constitution, and you're not allowed to dissolve cities. You'd have to go to the state legislature. So I consider them an extremely democratic form of government. All right? Finally, I think village boards should have the ability to abolish villages. And actually, we've had quite a few village boards look at this issue and put the vote to their residents. It's not as if the boards aren't looking at this. Many have. They've initiated studies. They put votes to their residents. Finally, I'm neither for or against. NICOM does not take a position on whether or not the village of Champlain should dissolve. Right? We're not for this or against this proposition. We don't weigh in on any village dissolution vote one way or another. All right? Any questions about NICOM's positions? Those are the 6 points I want to make before I really get into this. I'm going to talk really about two things. The procedure under the vote, because I think there's a lot of confusion. It is not a straightforward process. And obviously, probably most of you, I really think this is exciting stuff. I'm one of two people in the state of New York who does think it's really exciting stuff. I don't blame you for not thinking it's exciting. You probably really haven't delved into it all that much to understand completely what the process is. So I'm going to talk about the process and procedure. The other thing is I'm going to talk about some of the substantive issues. All right? So that'll be on the second half of the presentation this evening. I want to point out, I showed you all the dissolution activity that there is to start with, okay? There have been a ton of studies. You can go online, you can Google the village dissolution in New York, and it'll give you study after study. And if you go to a website of the Center for Government Research, www.cgr.org, it is a not-for-profit entity based out of Rochester, New York. They've done most of the dissolution studies that have been conducted recently. They put them all online. So you can go and look at them and see, what are those studies shown or indicated. I think it can be helpful and useful. But you need to be careful about looking at what's happened in other villages. And you've got a little bit of activity up here, right, with Village of Malone has looked at it, Village of Keysville, Ticonderoga, dissolved back in the 90s. Saranac Lakes looked at government restructuring. So there's no shortage of studies out there. But you have to be careful at drawing conclusions from those studies. Don't look at those studies and say, oh, what they did there, that's what's going to happen here. They had X dollars in tax savings, that's what's going to happen to us. Oh, their services, it didn't work out. Oh, it worked out fine. Right? Every village dissolution is different because every village is different and every town in which the villages are located are different. Some towns are urban, some towns are rural. Some villages have a lot of services, some have fewer services. Okay? So you can't just draw an apples-to-apples comparison from all those studies that have been done. All right? Briefly, Article 17-A, and there's material on the Department of State website that if you just Google this, it'll take you to their guide. It's a pretty complicated law. It's very dense. I'm going to summarize it, okay? So I may not hit on all the minute technical components. We don't have that much time this evening, and you guys are going to go running for the doors if I went through that. So I am going to go over just some of briefly the components. There are two ways that a village could be dissolved. It could be dissolved or it can be consolidated, and those are really legal terms. A dissolution is really the vote just of the village to cease its existence. It would be possible, potentially, for the village to cease its existence through a consolidation with the town. I'll talk a little bit about that, the two procedures there. Both of those procedures, whether it's dissolution and consolidation, under the law could be initiated by the governing board, so the village board could initiate it. You're in the elector initiated process. A petition was signed, circulated in the village, and signed by a sufficient number of residents and submitted to the village. That's the process you're under, all right? Consolidation, although you could have chosen that route, and the reason I talk about this, are there any residents from the town outside of the village here tonight? Two. All right. No, everybody else is a village resident? You don't have to say. The town residents outside of the village, why would they care? Why would they come to our meeting on village dissolution? What? Well, because they work there, they have to, but sometimes I frequently get at these presentations residents from the town outside of the village. They come and they're not very happy because should the village decide to dissolve, most likely their taxes are going to go up. And they're here because, my taxes are going to go up and I don't get a vote in this? And the answer is, that is right. You do not get a vote in this because only the village residents get a vote on whether or not to dissolve the village. I'll talk a little bit later about why their taxes are going to likely go up. I would wager good money. The consolidation process, which would have allowed town residents to vote on whether or not to consolidate the town and the village by basically dissolving the village, but give everybody a vote, it doesn't happen for two reasons. A, because it requires two petitions instead of just one. And of course, anytime you have to do something twice, it's more difficult. The second reason is it would require those town residents outside of the village, a majority of the total town residents, to agree to the dissolution. And if their taxes are going to go up, are they likely to agree to that?
No.
No, that's right. I can't make a good argument why they would. Sometimes I say, but come on, it might be a more efficient structure, right? We might get 1% efficiency increase. Do it for the sake of efficiency. No, they don't do that. So I refer to this as a leveling up, where you have, somebody's taxes are increased, and the reason, we'll talk a little bit about that more later as well. So consolidation really doesn't happen. Not even when everybody's taxes are likely to go down. There's been one instance where that occurred, and it wasn't in a village dissolution. I showed you the chart of all the village dissolutions votes we've had since this new law was put into place in 2010. Well, you could use this law also to, even though you can't dissolve towns, you can consolidate towns. We've had one town consolidation vote. The towns of Homer and Scott in Cortland County, just north of the city of Cortland, voted to consolidate back in 2010. And everybody's taxes were going to go down. One town's taxes were going to be cut in half. They were going to go down 50%, and the other town's taxes were going to go down 7% as a result of the consolidation. And one town voted it down, and one town approved it. Right? Everybody's taxes are going to go down. What's it? Well, which town do you think voted it down? The 50% tax reduction town voted it down. Why do you think they voted it down? Why would you vote something down? You're going to save a ton of money on your taxes. Well, they were the smaller town. They had the fewer residents, and their concern was, are we going to have a voice in this new, larger town should we decide to dissolve? Right? Which is always a concern, even in village dissolutions as well. It's a major concern. Are we going to have a voice at the town government should the village dissolve, right? So I just put that out there. Consolidation is not likely to occur. All right. So dissolution, I mentioned this. It's defined as the termination of the existence of a local government entity. I mentioned towns are excluded. You could dissolve districts, and that's what, when this law was put into place and adopted by the legislature in 2009, they came out and said at the time this law was drafted by the Attorney General Cuomo, now Governor Cuomo, and he said, we've got too many local government entities. We have 10,500 local government entities. We have 932 towns, we have 62 cities, we have 550 villages, we have 57 counties outside of the city of New York. We've got some 1,000+ school districts, and we got like 6,500 special districts. We got too many local government entities. Okay? You can't dissolve towns, so that 932 is off. This law doesn't apply to school districts. You can't dissolve cities under this law. It does affect districts, but we've had one district dissolution vote under this law. It was voted down last year, I think it was. Why don't you think people are going to dissolve a district? What kind of districts are there? What are we talking about? Most of the districts, well, not school districts. I'm talking about town special districts. I'm sorry, I should be clear. Water districts, sewer districts, fire districts, those are the big ones. Those are the majority there. And those are the biggest costs. There are street lighting districts, and there are sidewalk districts, there are garbage districts. But if you get rid of garbage districts, somebody's got to pay for it somehow. You've got to pick it up some other side. Who wants to get rid of fire protection? Who wants to say, I don't want to have fire protection? Right? So it's not really practical. We haven't seen any dissolution activity with respect to the town special districts and the fire districts, right? Because those are generally formed to fulfill a local demand or need, okay? So the law really is only being used, and this is what we said to the legislature and the Attorney General staff at the time, to dissolve villages. Villages were being dissolved beforehand. This is not new. So that's a reason really why I think the law didn't make any substantial changes to how we restructure local governments in the state of New York. It's only still with villages, and it hasn't been very good at dissolving villages. The rate of approval votes on village dissolution, I mentioned there have been 19 votes, 3 of which have voted to dissolve. That's about a 17% approval rate. Under the old law, which the legislature apparently didn't like because they repealed it, it was above 50% approval for dissolution. Now, I'm not arguing that we should dissolve villages, right? But I'm just saying, what is going on there if we had this higher approval rate under the law that the legislature apparently deemed was not good? What's the procedure? And the reason I kind of harp on this, because I'm going to get to this, and people often yell at me, well, why did you draft this law or file a petition? I neither drafted the law nor did I file the petition. I just want to make that clear here as we go along, right? So how does the petition process work? The law states that electors, meaning registered voters of a village, may initiate the dissolution process by filing a petition. The petition must be filed or signed by 10% of the village electors. Now, the number you gave me was 544, right? Is your total number of village electors. So you need 55 signatures. Is that the number, right? So a petition had to be filed and was filed back in December, signed by at least 55 registered voters of the village, who were also qualified voters, meaning they were residents registered to vote in the village. All right? That initiated the process. You don't have less than 500 electors. You have 544. If you had fewer than 500 electors, it would have been a 20% requirement. So some of the issues that we see that come up in this process at this point, both at the time the petition is being circulated and right before a vote after a petition has been filed, are confusion about what the process is. The first one is, it's just to study dissolution. That's what this process is. When you sign the petition, it was just a petition to say, hey, let's study dissolution of the village. No, that's not what you signed, if you signed it. You signed a petition to have a vote on whether or not to dissolve the village. On March 19th, on the ballot, it's going to say this: shall the village of Champlain be dissolved? Yes or no? Not, shall we study whether or not to dissolve the village of Champlain? It's shall the Village of Champlain be dissolved? Anybody have any questions about this? There is a potential second bite at the apple, which I'll talk about in a second, but this puts you down the path of, hey, you're going to dissolve. This is why I don't like the law. Because of all those dissolution votes that have occurred, the 19 that have occurred, there's only one that was able to put together a dissolution study / plan prior to the vote, to give the residents of the community some kind of general idea about what would happen should they decide to dissolve the village. You're not going to have, I don't think, there's no study that's been done, there's no indication that there's any plan or study in place that you're going to know about before you have the vote on March 19th. And I think it's an inherently undemocratic process. Dissolving a village is an extremely complicated issue. You have to figure out what happens to all of the services that the village provides. You have to figure out what happens to all of the assets that a village owns. You have to figure out what happens to all of the obligations or liabilities that the village is responsible for. Okay? You don't want to hurry through that process. It is an extremely complicated process. That is why I don't like this new law, and you didn't do that under the old law. Now the difference between the new law and the old law is the new law allows only 10% of the village electors to initiate the process. You only needed 10% of the village electors to sign a petition. Under the old law, you needed a third of the village's electors. So it was a higher threshold. It was more difficult to get those signatures. And the reason it was so high is because studying dissolution is complicated. But there in the old law, you did a study and developed a plan before you voted. Again, that's the difference between you and the Village of Victory on March 19th. They're going to have a plan in place. They operated under Article 19 of the village law. All right? Some of the other things. If you dissolve the village, you're going to save everything you pay in village taxes. That's how much money you're going to save. Never happened. It's never happened. I will wager the village residents are going to pay less taxes should they dissolve the village. The best approximation, the best guess I can give you for how much you're going to save in village taxes, and this is a guess, don't hold me to this, I'm not promising anything, but should the village vote to dissolve and actually dissolve, you'll save approximately what you're paying in town taxes now, give or take. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but it's what all of the dissolution studies really have shown. When we've looked at them and seen what the reduction in taxes paid by village residents has been, it's been what they were paying in town taxes prior to the dissolution. Okay? So, village taxes are your lion's share. I'm sure you pay more in village taxes than you do in town taxes as a village residents, right? As a general rule.
No.
We pay more
We pay more in town.
No.
All right, then I might have to step back. That's still my best guess for what the approximation is. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a second as well. Finally, here says the town will provide all the services that the village is providing now. All right? And the answer to that is, it depends. I don't know. What has the town said? Has the town told you, yes, we're going to provide X, Y, and Z, and this is how we're going to provide it? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends from community to community, dissolution to dissolution. So, going back more to the process and procedure, the town, I should say, I want to stress here, the town's not obligated to provide all the services that the village is providing now. They will be legally obligated to take over the maintenance and repair of your roads. But street lighting, they're not legally obligated to do. Sidewalks, they're not legally obligated to do. For your water and sewer, districts are going to be formed to take over the operation, maintenance, and financing of those physical improvements and services. Yes, ma'am?
The state will still take care of the state roads, right?
Yeah, to the extent that you have a state highway that is currently maintained by the state, and whether they do that themselves or they have some agreement with some other entity, because they can do that as well. Sometimes they contract with the county or the town or even the city or village or whatever, to do the state highways. They would still do that, right? So to the extent that it's a state road, that doesn't change really anything by the dissolution of the village. We're really only talking about the village streets for which the village is responsible for maintaining, filling potholes, repaving, plowing for snow in the winter. That will all shift to the responsibility of the town. Okay? Any other questions about that? But for some of the other things, like brush and leaf pickup, which you get to from the village, and I don't know what else, the town is not obligated to take over their services. They may, there's the potential that they could, it's up to the town. You would have to go and have the town council and the supervisor, answer that question for you. So the process, going back to this, yes, sir?
How can you say that the town has to take over these services that would be paying less town tax?
I'll get to that. That's a good question. The question is, how can we be paying less town taxes, or less total taxes, really? Because your town taxes are going to go up, right? How can we be paying less total taxes if the town's taking over these services? I will get to that in a second. Make sure I come back to it. I'm sure I'm going to answer it, but just hold me to my word, okay? All right? So the process is, right, a petition was filed, the clerk has to certify it, has to forward it on to the village board. The village board has 30 days within receipt of the petition from the clerk to meet and then schedule a vote. They've done that, your vote is March 19th, right? I put this out here, it's likely to be uninformed and consequently very divisive, and that's what we've seen in practically all of the village dissolution votes under this new law. If you vote no on March 19th, the dissolution fails and another dissolution may not be initiated for 4 years. It's a 4-year moratorium on the village dissolution process. If it passes, then you develop the plan for what happens, how the village dissolves, and what happens once the village is gone. That's the process and procedure if you vote yes on March 19th. Any questions? The reason I say, and I mentioned you get a second bite at the apple. Here's the threshold. This is how many signatures you needed in the village of Champlain with 544 registered voters. How many signatures you needed per day, assuming that you collected the signatures over a 180-day period. There's no time period for collecting the signatures under the new law. It's a question we try to get an answer to. Do signatures ever become stale? We haven't been able to get that from either the Attorney General's office or the Department of State. But I just picked a 180-day period, so 6 months. If somebody went around with a petition for 6 months to collect signatures to initiate the dissolution process under this new law, right, 17A, they would have to collect 0.3 signatures per day, or about 1 every 3 days. To have a second vote, once the plan is approved by the Board of Trustees, and I'll talk about that in a second when they do that, a year from now, should you vote to dissolve on March 19th, you have a second opportunity to file another petition, right? That second petition must be filed within 45 days of the village adopting the dissolution plan. That second petition has to be signed by 25% of the village electors. So 2.5 times the number of signatures is required in a very short time frame. Again, only 45 days. So then you would need to get 3 signatures per day to meet the threshold there. Now this is why I think it's really, you gotta be careful. Could you have a second vote? Yes, you may. The village of Altamar had a second vote. We'll see if the village of Lyons and the village of Keysville will have second votes. They haven't gotten to that part of the dissolution process yet. But this is a high standard. This is what the standard was under the old law that the legislature thought was too difficult. Under the old law, you would have needed to collect 1.5 signatures over a 120-day period to initiate the dissolution process pursuant to the now repealed Article 19 of the village law. They said that was too difficult. It's twice as difficult under the new law. So I just caution you, could you have a second bite at the apple? Could you have a second vote after you develop the plan and do the study? Potentially, maybe, but it's not guaranteed. You had a question, Ellie? Yes.
So we couldn't start trying to get those signatures before the vote,
No, you cannot.
only after
It's
they
the-
make the plan.
That's right. And this is one of the things, I mean, in addition to the fundamental procedural problems with the law, being that they put the cart before the horse and making you vote before you have a study, it has many technical deficiencies in it. It doesn't put a time frame for how long, how many days you have to collect the signatures initially. It's the only petition process in the state of New York that I'm aware of where they don't put a window of a number of days that you have to collect the signatures to initiate the petition. I'm not aware of any other one in the state of New York law. So that's one problem. On this back end, the reason they want this they made it difficult on purpose. They made it so there is not a guarantee that you will get a second bite at the apple. We couldn't figure out. We were like, why don't you just have a mandatory vote after the plan is developed? It made no sense. And the response that we were given from the Attorney General staff back in 2009 was, you can't trust the village board to develop a good plan. If the residents were sure that they would have a second vote, the board of trustees would develop such a bad plan that nobody would vote for it. It stings me because, frankly, it says they're really implying some very negative things about the local officials who represent your community for practically nothing, right, in pay. Don't even get me started. I'm getting worked up right now. All right?
Sorry.
But that's the reason. They made it difficult on purpose because you better be careful, Board of Trustees. You better develop the best plan possible because, boy, you never know what's going to happen. It may go into effect. So that's why it's such a high burden, that second bite at the apple. We'll see how Lyons and Keysville do. I've heard indication from both communities that there are constituents in those communities who intend to circulate and get the requisite number of signatures within the 45-day period. You had a question about it.
Yeah, if another petition is brought before the board, what would that referendum say? What would it state? Do you approve it to start?
That's a good question. The question is, if the second petition comes in, what is the referendum that goes before the voters then? Its language is a little bit different. It's actually set forth in statute, and it says, shall the village dissolution plan to dissolve the village of Champlain take effect? Now, there's a couple of I don't want to get, that's way down the road, and you kind of cross that bridge when you come to it. There's some important distinctions between the two votes. One of the most important ones is, well, what happens if you vote if you vote that now, right? People have said, well, then you've got to redo the plan. No, I don't think you have to redo the plan. But the moratorium does not take effect. There is no additional 4-year moratorium. So somebody could file another petition and make you go through the process again right away. Do I anticipate that happening? There's a general rule, no, because they're going to see the writing on the wall. And if you make people go through this process and developing a plan, I really don't think that's likely to happen again, because then they still have to get the requisite number of signatures. All right? Yes, ma'am.
What sort of obligations the village board under once they adopted the plan as far as announcing to the public that this date we adopted it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question is, what about the procedure? I'll get to that in a second. Make sure I come back to both of your questions. It jumps in a little bit. I will talk about that procedure in a second. Let me turn quickly, though, to the process of, okay, we got to develop the plan. So I want to talk a little bit about the substance of what happens when a village decides to dissolve. And really to understand that, you need to understand that village dissolution is a town issue. Yes, your question.
Wait, before we read the other slide, I just want for clarification, that second petition that needs to be ran, that can only, the last petition, if we want to bring this back to referendum,
Yes.
that can only be done by an elector of the village, correct? It can't be done by a board member the operation of that petition.
Well,
For clarification over who has
to
to
sign a
what-
petition, the question is, well, who can circulate the petition, or who can,
Who can circulate it?
a board member can circulate it. There's no, a board, just because you get elected to be a village board member, board of trustees, or mayor, doesn't mean you give up your rights to vote or in village elections or to sign petitions, all right? So they could circulate the petition to have a valid signature, right? To count as one of the 136 signatures that are needed. You need to be a qualified voter of the village, meaning you need to be a resident of the village, a citizen of the United States, at least 18 years of age, and registered to vote. Okay? So if anybody who meets that criteria, they can sign the petition and have it be valid. Okay? The petitions also need to be witnessed. I don't want to get into the legal complexities of that because frankly, it's complicated and the law is invalid. The statute that they wrote does not comply with case law that came down from the federal Second Circuit Court of Appeals. You don't need to know that. Sorry.
Thank you, I just wanted to clarify that.
Right.
I wasn't sure.
Village dissolution is a town issue. It is a town issue for two reasons. First of all, because the town determines how services are going to be provided should the village dissolve. And you need to think about this. I mean, the other coin, the other side of the village dissolution coin is, shall we dissolve the village? But you're also saying, shall we rely solely on the town to provide services to us and represent us democratically at the local level? Because that's what you're going to be doing. When the village is gone, you're going to have to go to the town. Okay? So the town determines and dictates how the dissolution will actually take effect and what ultimately will happen should the village decide to dissolve. In many respects, I believe the law should be amended so that if a petition is filed, the onus is not and the responsibility is not with the village to develop the plan. I think the town should be responsible for developing the plan. We've seen too many problems with, I'm sympathetic to the town, right? The town supervisor and council, they get put into the spot of, what are you going to do should the village dissolve? And this is, as I mentioned before, divisive process. They're representing these different constituencies. Whatever they decide to do, it may benefit the village residents, but require the town residents outside of the village to pay more taxes, right? It's a difficult process. So there's that. The second thing is, and the second reason why this is a town issue, is because the majority of your tax savings are attributable to the fact that you as village residents subsidize the town taxes. The reason you do that is how the state of New York has set up town taxation of village residents. This isn't to blame the town supervisor or the town council. It's not that they're being malicious, right? The state law creates this subsidy requirement, okay? And the reason, how many people are familiar with the town budget process? You all attended the town budget process hearings last year, October, right? Everybody went? Why not? You're all town residents, you all pay town taxes. You need to be involved in the town process because you are a town resident and you do pay town taxes. I'm going to go over this briefly. The town budget is, unfortunately, boy, I have a lot of sympathy for the town officials. Their budgets are extremely complex for those towns that have villages located in them. All towns' budgets are divided into two parts, a general fund and a highway fund. If a town has a village in its boundaries, it's divided into four parts. Each general fund has a town-wide part, and it has a town outside of village part, sometimes referred to as a part-town part. Same thing for the highway fund. For every expense that the town has when they're developing a budget, they have to go through and they have to say, is this the general fund? If it's the general fund, is it town-wide or town outside of village? Every expense, every line item in the town budget, they have to do that for. Well, how does this affect your taxes? Well, it affects your taxes because you pay all those town-wide taxes. You pay taxes for town expenses. And just the way it's set up, you're paying for services and expenses you don't necessarily get back a service and expense for, right? You're not really necessarily receiving a benefit from that. The other way village residents subsidize towns is that while you pay for the town highway fund, who pays for the maintenance of the village streets and roads? Only the village residents. When the village dissolves, as I mentioned before, the town has to come in and take over the maintenance and operation of those roads. So the town's responsibility goes up. That comes out of their town taxes are going to go up, right? It's just the way it works. And that's why your taxes go down and the town residents outside of the village taxes go up. This subsidy is not well understood. And again, it's the reason why we get a lot of opposition from residents of the town outside of the village. Did we get any town outside of the village residents come in since I first started this presentation? All right. You know, I mentioned the Village of Saranac Lake local government restructuring study that they did a couple years ago. And the poor supervisor who kind of stepped in it. They were talking about becoming a city, right? Because that's what really made sense there. We'll become a city. And one of the town supervisors, interviewed by a local reporter, said, well, I'm not going to agree to that. And the reporter said, well, why won't you agree to the village becoming a city? He said, because if the village becomes a city, it's no longer part of my town, and I'm going to lose part of my tax base. I'm going to lose $115,000, I think it was, every year in taxes. I'm not going to agree to that. And the reporter said, yeah, but you lose that revenue, but you also won't have to provide services to the village anymore. So, you know, it should balance out. And the supervisor, God bless him, said, but I don't provide any services to the village. Whoops is right? I don't provide any services to the village. It's the example of the subsidization of the village, of the town by the village, okay? And it's been demonstrated in frankly every village dissolution study that I've seen and every village dissolution that's taken effect. That's where it comes from. Any questions about that? Yes, sir.
What kind of leverage do village residents have, supposing once in a while we get a heavy snowstorm? So the town plows are out taking care of the town plows, and we get left behind. How do we influence, I suppose you can't answer that, it's up to us. How do we influence the town to say, hey, make us a priority? We have more people concentrated here. Take care of us.
You mean should the village dissolve? Do you guys plow your own streets or do you have an agreement, right? You're saying should the village dissolve,
yeah.
right? That's a political determination. That's a public policy determination that has to be made by the local government officials. That's what local government officials do all the time.
But that's something we have to think about.
That's right. If you should decide to dissolve, you say, are we going to have a voice at the town level? Are they going to take our needs and concerns into account when making those kinds of determinations? I mean, and it's a political decision that you're making. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't that, say you vote, yes, to close it, wouldn't that study they do determine that in black and white?
That question is, won't the study determine that specific issue? You know, when are they going to plow?
Or lighting, or sidewalks?
Yeah, absolutely. The study should address
Right.
like things like
Step by
service.
step.
Absolutely. Regarding that kind of thing, where, you know, how are our streets, it could. It's something I think that you want to ask and address. What's going to be the policy of the town? Should the village dissolve regarding street plowing? You know, how are you going to go about doing that? I mean, as a general rule, it makes sense. From a cost-benefit perspective, we want to provide quickest service to most people, right? And that's generally how it works. Most local governments would do that. So you just want to make sure that that is what the policy of the town's going to be should the village dissolve. I'll come back, we'll discuss that more because it's kind of related to her question as well. Make sure I hit on it that more. Yes, question over here.
Just like Dr. Zelda mentioned, I wondered what kind of leverage we would have, because we're sitting right on the Canadian border. Unless you work in Canada, you wouldn't necessarily travel in the morning on village roads to get to work. Everybody from the village needs to go out of the village onto the town hall.
Those are discussions that you will have to have with the town. That's something, again, that should be addressed in the plan or the study that's developed. There's no doubt about it. When you get to that point, you're gonna have to say, hey, you know what, we wanna make sure these are concerns of ours. How is the town going to implement or provide service to us should the village no longer exist, right? And it's a political process. That's what they do right now in the town outside of the village. That's what you do within the village, frankly. Now, it's a little bit different. The question comes up, and one of the things that I think communities really should, this is a complex issue because you're dealing with so many different factors and variables, both from the different kinds of communities, to the different kinds of services, to the different ways that you raise revenue, which is a completely, it's a complicating factor. I think another thing to think about is what's the basis for our boundaries, our local government boundaries? Because that is one of the things you're going to have to talk about. You know, there is, as a general rule, a natural boundary that surrounds the village. It separates a developed area that has a lot of houses closely located together from a rural area. Those are two distinct communities. One is rural, they don't have water or sewer. They don't have street lights or sidewalks, right? They don't want or need brush collection or leaf collection. So how does that work? When you have the village and you have a community that is all similar in nature, it is easier for that local government to represent them. There's no doubt about that. And there's a ton of literature that you think this is boring. People study this in graduate school. It's what they do. Right? And they look at what should be the basis for local government boundaries. How do you look and find the most efficient? How do you find ones that represent the communities effectively and democratically? Right? And it's one of the ways I think is maybe easier to look at this. What boundaries are rational? What boundaries are rational? I'll come back to that in a second. So that's really an important part. You need to understand that. And going back to the whole question too, kind of about fairness, I think somebody kind of implied this or asked this. There are, even when it's done pursuant to the letter of the law, right? When the towns get everything right in their budget, what should be town-wide and what should be town outside of the village residents, just because that's the way the law is structured, they subsidize town operations. Some towns, some supervisors and councils, they say, you know what, this isn't fair, you know, the village isn't getting a service from us, and they deviate from state law. They will actually go and they'll say, you know, state law says this is supposed to be town-wide, but I'm going to make this town outside of village expense. So it's only raised by tax on those properties located outside of the village. OSC, the Office of State Comptroller, they've gone in and they've audited towns, and they've found towns that have improperly allocated expenses that should be town-wide to town outside the village, and vice versa. So, you know, you can say, hey, is the town kind of representing us fairly at the town level on the budget process? Some are, some they make mistakes, some try to be more than fair and violate state law because they're trying to be fair to their village residents. And if that's the case, and here's the irony, in those instances where towns are kind of disregarding state law about how the town expenses are supposed to be allocated to make it fair, in those instances when the village dissolves, there's really nominal tax savings for village residents because they're already saving you taxes by doing that. Now, the town of, is the town of Champlain too, right? Is that right? They could be doing it, I don't know. If they're doing that, then you're not likely to see as much tax savings, right? Moving on. There are 6 areas of cost and tax savings that we encounter. The first one is economies of scale, right? This is economics 101. For everybody who took it in high school and college, economies of scale, right? If we get a little bit bigger and we're going to have less overhead and the marginal cost of providing a service is going to be less, all right? There's likely to be some economies of scale. Not always. There's likely to be some economies of scale. It's a very small amount. A very small amount of efficiency that you're going to see from this. And I think this is what everybody thinks about. The state legislature and the state officials, when they're looking at all these local governments and they say, stop whining about your taxes and how little aid you get from the state, be more efficient. municipalities, cities, towns, and villages are extremely efficient. Why are they extremely efficient? Anyone guess? A, because they're the government closest to the people. That's the first one, right? You all see the mayor probably relatively regularly, more frequently than you see your senator or assemblyman, more frequently than you see your county representative, more frequently than you see the governor, right? So you see this official and also your trustees on a regular basis. There's another reason. What's the major funding source for municipal operations? The real property tax, not just taxes, the real property tax. People are very sensitive to the real property tax. You're not as sensitive. Where does the state get most of its money from you? No, the state doesn't impose a real property tax. Income tax. You don't see your income tax, right? You don't feel that because it gets taken out before you get it. I mean, I say that, people say, I see that on my pay stub. What do you mean I don't feel that? But you adjust and you will budget automatically, right? And it's spread over 26 pay periods or 12 pay periods, whatever you get paid. Okay? The real property tax imposes a ton of pressure on local taxes. And the thought or concept that the state imposed this 2% tax cap and now local governments are being responsible is ridiculous. Because local governments were keeping their expenses down before. The lion's share also of your local real property tax is schools, which is not going to be affected at all by whether or not you dissolve the village, right? Not going to be affected at all by village dissolution. Your school tax is entirely separate, all right? So let's move on to your other potential cost and tax savings, and I differentiate between the two. A cost savings is one thing, and tax savings is another, all right? You can have a cost savings, the total cost of providing service may go up or down as a result of village dissolution, but your taxes can go in the opposite direction because of a variety of factors. You can experience savings from discontinuing service. So for example, if you dissolve and the town decides not to do brush or leaf collection, okay, well, and you don't form a district for that, well, you're not going to have that cost anymore. You're also not going to have that service, but you're not going to have that cost. So you're going to see some savings for that. Do you just put the brush and leaf back out in the compost heap in the backyard? Well, or do you take it to somebody else on your own? That's discontinuing service. That's not an efficiency, everybody, right? That's not an efficiency. You could potentially restructure services. The reason I include this here, I don't think that will necessarily come to play in this instance, but sometimes there's restructuring that you would like to do that would make sense, that would be cost effective for the municipality, that would lower your taxes, but you can't do but for dissolving the village. And the example that I give out is in the Village of Johnson City case, a village down in Broome County, they looked at dissolving and they were going to dissolve and they were going to form all these districts, including a police district. Now you need special legislative authority to form a police district. I just want to point that out. You can't do that without the legislature giving you the say-so. But they were going to form a police district, and then instead of hiring directly policemen for that district, they were going to contract with the sheriff. And because the sheriff paid his deputies less than what the village was paying its police officers, they were going to see a savings. The village couldn't do that without dissolve. And that's because the state's labor law would not allow it. Doing that would be a mandatory subject of negotiation, subject to arbitration. The union, the police union would have to agree to that, and of course they would never agree to that, right? So I put that up there. That's an example of restructuring. Eliminating of elected officials. So you're going to save whatever you pay them in salary or benefits. I don't know what that is. That may or may not be an efficiency. I don't necessarily include it as an efficiency because the question is the town going to be able to provide you the same level of representation and responsiveness as the village, as having your own village board of trustees and mayor will have? If the answer is yes, then that would be an efficiency. If the answer is no, then you're really giving up something. You're giving up some representation in exchange for some cost savings. Number 5, potential increase in aid from the state. How many people have heard about this? There is what is called the Citizens Empowerment Tax Credit. And some people say if we dissolve, we're going to get this huge pot of money. And the state has now for several years, subject to annual appropriation, I'll explain that in a second if you don't know what I mean, said that for those villages that dissolve and districts that consolidate and towns that consolidate, we will increase the amount of aid that we give you. Right? And that amount of aid will be equal to 15% of the combined tax levy of the village and the town, capped at $1 million. I don't think you would hit the $1 million there. So that would potentially be a significant amount. I haven't looked it up. I imagine the town would get probably somewhere $100,000. I don't know, maybe more. I don't know. I'd have to look up what your assessed value is for the town and village property to do that calculation. I can provide that tomorrow if you're interested. My recommendation is don't factor this into your consideration. The reason being is this is not guaranteed. If you want to rely on this, go get your senator or assemblyman to state in writing that you will have this money forever. Go get the governor's office to say, we by here guarantee that the town of Champlain will have this money forever. Because it is subject to annual appropriation. Here's the other rub. If you dissolve the village of Champlain, you're going to get rid of one village. So that 10,500 number is going to go down by 1. You're going to have 10,499 in the state of New York. But you are going to create a water district. We're back up to 10,500. You're going to create a sewer district. You're now at 10,501. If you need a street lighting district, we're going to be at 10,502. And if you want a sidewalk district to take care of maintenance of your sidewalks, you're going to be at 10,503. All right. So we've actually increased the local number of local government entities. Is the state really going to be paying the town to increase the number of local government entities? They come out here and say, we have too many. Are we going to pay to increase that number? And right now there is no, they just hand out the money. But I think down the road, when people start looking at this and saying, well, what are we getting for this money? I mean, the village of Seneca Falls, well, I should say the town of Seneca Falls now gets over $500,000 a year in increased aid from the state. They did not reduce any local government entities, and their efficiencies that they achieved are non-existent. And yet the state is paying them $500,000 a year. And by the state, I mean you all and I are paying the town of Seneca Falls $500,000 a year. It's bad public policy. Maybe you'll get the money, which is great, fine. But I argue if you vote for dissolution, don't do it because of this aid, because it may not be there. Do it because it makes sense for your community. You had a question, sir?
I think you answered it. My question was, or is, the state aid a one-time deal? Or
No, the state aid, in theory, it's supposed to be every year, right? In theory. But it is subject to annual appropriation, meaning every year the state has to put it in its budget that you're going to get this. So, and here's the thing, they've actually changed this incentive. I think we're now on the 4th different version of it. It used to be, it started out and you got like $250,000, one-time deal. And then they said, oh no, we're going to give you an increase that's in perpetuity, or you can choose $750,000 paid out over 5 years or something like that. I forget what it is. And then they said, okay, we're going to give you this increase, and it's going to be 7 or 15% of your combined town and village tax levy. Oh, now 70% of that has to go for tax relief. Although, what does that mean? Nobody knows. All right. So it's actually changed over the years. You know, the past I think 8 years they've had it in place. So there's no guarantee. That's why I say for anybody who says no, we're going to get this money in perpetuity, I'm like, get that in writing. Who's your senator? No, the state senator. State senator. So, see if she will commit to that in writing. Who's your assemblyman? Okay, so call them up and say, hey, will you guarantee that we'll get this in perpetuity, forever? Then see what they say. All right? So the final one, and again, this is the largest source of your tax savings, comes from that, again, no longer subsidizing town operations. And that's where your tax savings come from. And you know what, people say, your taxes, I'm fairly confident are going to go down. How much? I don't know. But it's not because of efficiencies. It's not because, having these two government entities is really inefficient. We just have not seen that. It's not as if the village has a lot of people sitting around doing nothing, and the town has a lot of people sitting around doing nothing. I mean, none of the dissolution studies have shown that. None of the dissolutions that have actually been undertaken have shown that there have been massive efficiencies or economies of the scale that have been achieved. Okay? Yes, ma'am?
Did you mention number 4? I was wondering what you said about that.
Elimination of elected officials, right? You'd be getting rid of your mayor and your board of trustees, and the question is whether or not that's worth it. If the town can represent you, if the town council and supervisor can represent you and your interests of the villages, other village residents and property owners adequately, well then that would be an efficiency, but it's not necessarily the case, right? If you're losing representation, if you're losing a voice, then that's not an efficiency at all. If you're not going to have somebody that's going to represent your community in times of need with as strong a voice as having your own mayor and your own board of trustees, that depends. There's a great documentary. The smallest village in the state is called the Village of West Hampton Dunes, and it's one of the more recent villages. It was created in 1994. And it was created, this is an aside, but I love to tell the story. There's actually a documentary about the formation of this village, the village government. It's a little village on one of the barrier islands down on the south shore of Long Island. And it came about because of beach erosion. And there was a project to preserve the beach, and then they built these, I forget what they're called, these barriers that help prevent beach erosion, but they ran out of money, the county and the state, and so they stopped, which then made beach erosion really bad on the southern part of the beach. And they complained, they're like, hey, our beach is going away, and then we had the perfect storm that they made the movie about and wrote the book about that wiped this community out. 300 houses went off into the Atlantic Ocean. And the town wouldn't let them onto their properties because it's not safe. They're like, we got to get out there, right? And the county was not sympathetic to them. And the state kind of had an agreement, and then they didn't. And then they had the Army Corps of Engineers. And they didn't have any way to fight for themselves because everybody was like, I'll contribute a little bit, but they couldn't raise taxes or levy. So they formed a village. And within 14 days of forming a village, they had a settlement with the state and the county and the federal government to restore their beach and bring it back to where it was. Because they had a voice. They had a mayor. Now, does everybody need a mayor? I do not believe that the entire state should be covered in villages. That makes no sense. Right? I'm not saying that every hamlet has to have a village government. But it begs the question, are you going to have a voice? It begs the question, are you going to have a voice? Yeah, yes.
I didn't hear you mention anything about the other meeting, the state man indicated that even though they got all of our assets in the town, we still have the water district.
I'll get there. The question is about village assets and village liabilities or debt and obligations and what happens. I will get there in a second. I owe you something, make sure I get back to this. All right? So I talked about this in town as a town issue because of the town tax, and it's a town issue because the town determines how things happen. There is one answer to what happens should the village dissolve. And if you look at a lot of the dissolution studies that have been done, a lot of them give you 3 scenarios, right? This is where you're going to see the most potential tax savings for village residents. Here's the least amount of tax savings as village residents, and here's an in-between. I think that is a terrible way to go about doing a village dissolution study, right? Because you're like, okay, well, what's the answer then? There is one answer, and the answer is, what is the town, how are they going to provide services? Yes?
I don't think we're all worried about right now, but Champlain is not growing. People are moving out.
No,
When was
that's
the
a
last
question.
time we got a new home? What's
the
gonna
person.
happen if 50% of us are left to pick up everything?
Well,
That's what worries me.
I will say, and I'm not sure exactly what your question is, ma'am. The question is like, okay, and you're not alone. Boy, we're struggling here. We've got some empty buildings, we've got some abandoned buildings, we haven't had any new growth within the village. You are not alone, okay? Is your question, are we gonna have a voice should the village go away, or we need to dissolve the village because it's not really working right now? Is that your point?
Yes, because everything's gonna have to go up for the village, right? If more people move out.
Well, so the question is what happens, that's a good question. The question is, what's the future for the village? I think that is a
I
question.
can't see any.
Well, I think that question, though, is maybe a little bit related to village dissolution, but also separate from it. Because I mentioned this before, I don't know whether it was before some people were here and we were having a discussion. One of the villages that recently looked at studied dissolution back in 2007, they did a study and they said, well, let's look at those villages that actually dissolved and figure out why they decided to dissolve. And this was just in a footnote of the dissolution study. And they said those villages that decided to dissolve did so primarily for one of two reasons. A, they couldn't get people to serve on the board. Right? And clearly, if you can't get people to serve in local elected capacity, maybe you shouldn't have a local government. I think that's a conditioned precedent to having a local government. You have to have the human capacity to have a local government. B, they couldn't fiscally support a local government. And I think we've seen that in a couple of village dissolutions recently. The village of Limestone, the village of Pike, those two villages dissolved within the last 5 years, where the underlying community went away. And that happens. Communities grow, they're born, they grow, sometimes they thrive for a long time and they die. And if a community goes away, the question is, well, is there a need for a local government entity once it's gone? And that's a good question. It does beg the question, well, if we're going to have a community, though, how do we go forward? Some people would argue, and to be honest, in addition to handling this issue, I also handle economic and community development for the Conference of Mayors. This is a non-issue that is just the Village of Champlain. New York is an old state. We have old communities, right? Hundreds of years old, with old buildings that have old problems, and you are competing. Communities don't realize this. I'm switching in my economic development. I'm not going to spend too much time here. You are competing. Whether you actually know you're competing. Because if I'm a person coming in to look into, do I live in this village, or do I buy a house here, or do I buy a new construction house in the town outside of the village with nice open floor plan and nice new amenities and a nice new modern efficient heating system, or do I go in and you have some gorgeous homes here in Champlain as I was driving through, but boy, they're fixers-uppers, right? They're expensive, they're big, they're expensive to renovate and heat and maintain. You're competing. And you need to have a plan, you need to have a strategy. I think the number one goal, frankly, of local governments is long-term community development. It's very difficult for communities, though, to engage in that for a variety of reasons. A, because they have immediate short-term needs that often overwhelm them. You've got to deal with the budget on an annual year and infrastructure issues that take precedent. And B, the state of New York has not crafted very good community development tools. And this is a completely different issue, which I can come up and do a different presentation some other time. We don't have gap financing tools available. We don't have tools that allow the village. Now, you have some vacant and abandoned properties in the village I saw. I'm assuming they're abandoned. They look abandoned. That have maintenance issues that may need to be demolished. Who's going to pay for that? The state's not going to take responsibility for it. The village residents, that's right. But the state hasn't given you, the village residents, tools to deal with that. They've allowed, and this is if you would try to go after those property owners, state law doesn't allow you to go after them because they have a shell corporation and you can't go after them. So the taxpayers here of the village they're stuck with that burden. Sometimes I think the state of New York hates cities, as harsh as a statement as that is. Because A, they make village residents subsidize town taxes. Right? So if you want to live here in this village, you got to pay more. They don't give you the tools to deal with your aging and abandoned property. They just don't. And so you have to deal with that. You have to deal with tax exempt properties. I don't know how many tax exempt properties you have in the village, but cities and villages have an extremely high percentage of their properties that are tax exempt. And that puts more pressure on the remaining properties. Okay? But all of those factors are not related to village dissolution, really. With the exception of, is there going to be a voice that's going to champion the redevelopment and revitalization of your community? Okay? And I think having a village government can help that. It doesn't guarantee it, it can help. Right? Moving on, next question. So, going back to services, we're gonna try to wrap this up. Figuring out what's gonna happen should the village dissolve. It's a relatively simple and straightforward task that I think many of the studies have complicated unnecessarily. For every service, everything that the village does, you need to go through and you need to say, is the town going to take over this function and provide it via the town budget, either the general fund or the highway fund, and finance it town-wide? Okay? That would be a town-wide function. Are they going to take over the function, but they're going to finance it by forming a special district? A special district is a defined geographic area. It generally does not encompass the entire town. It encompasses only a part of the town. And that service, that physical improvement that the district is responsible for, is financed only by those properties that are located within the district. Okay? So that's the second option. And the third option is to terminate a function that the village is providing as a service. Those are the three things. So, for example, right, certain things are mandated by state law to be town-wide. So the highway maintenance, the town justice court, the town council and supervisor, I don't know if the town clerk's elected or if the town highway superintendent's elected as well. Those are all town-wide expenses that would come out of the general town tax that would be and is levied on the village property. Some of the administration expenses, although only some, are town-wide. Some are town outside the village. So, garbage collection, I know you don't have garbage collection here. We could change it, we could make this brush and leaf collection, all right? So the town could say, hey, we're going to take this over and provide this town-wide. I know this isn't a large expense, but for purposes there. They could say, no, we're not going to do this, but we'll form a special district for just the village, and we'll still provide this service. So you'll still get the same service that the village was providing before, but you're just going to pay for it. We're not going to fund that out of the town's general fund. Or finally, they're going to say, too bad, so sad, you're on your own. Each of these scenarios has different cost implications or tax implications, right? Here, you're going to save everything because that expense that you had before, you're not going to have anymore, right? But of course, then you're going to have to figure out what to do with your brush and leaf. If you put it out in the backyard and compost, well, that's a little bit of extra work. If you have to pay somebody to haul it away, okay, well, then you got to think about that. Maybe it's not 100% savings. If it's a town-wide expense, then that cost gets spread over all of the properties within the town. So you would see substantial savings and still maintain the level of service. Okay? If they form a district, you're not going to see any savings really. You're going to maintain the level of service, you're going to create a district, and only those properties within that area are going to shoulder that burden. So frequently, generally, the districts that are created when a village dissolves very closely match the village boundaries. Sometimes they're a little bit, sometimes they may go out and they extend further on, sometimes they're a little bit shorter, but they closely match the previous village's boundaries. You really don't see any efficiencies from this, you don't see any cost savings. Does everybody understand that? So you do this for each of the services you provide. So for example, okay, we're gonna have a district created to handle our brush and leaf pickup. Then we have to decide what are we doing with the street lighting. Okay, let's say we're gonna have a special district for street lighting. Then you have to do the same thing for the sidewalks. What are we gonna do for those? Are we gonna discontinue it? Is it gonna be a town function? Is it gonna be a special district? All right, and so at one point then you'll get down to, all right, we're gonna have a garbage district, we're gonna have a lighting district, and we're gonna have sidewalks financed townwide, or whatever. That, if you go through all the services the village provides, that will get you your one plan, your one solution. And you'll be able to basically see what the impact will be initially for dissolving the village. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yes, sir.
Who's responsible and who sets up the district? Is it primarily the town?
That's a good question. The formation of special districts is governed by town law. As a general rule, villages don't have districts. They provide every service to everybody in the municipality because, for the most part, villages and cities are relatively homogeneous. It's densely populated, everybody receives the same benefit and the same service. For towns, that's not the case. You have a mixture in there. So the town law actually has a procedure for creating districts. The creation of all districts under the town law is subject to a referendum requirement. Now here's the thing, and I think I'm right, there have been some people who have expressed other opinions. The plan that is developed by the village in your dissolution process, it is not binding. Okay? And people say, what? It's not binding, that makes no sense whatsoever. Well, it's not binding for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not binding because under New York State law, and actually as a general principle in democratic societies, we have what's called a principle against binding future boards. And it means that you cannot bind a future democratically elected board or future residents or constituents to a governmental decision that you make. So there's A, that principle. And B, you wouldn't necessarily want to bind the town or the future residents to your plan because it's a plan and you're estimating what's going to happen. And what actually happens is invariably going to be something different. You're going to want to have some flexibility to modify how you go forward as a community. Okay? So, having said that, and I'll give you an example right now. The Village of Altmar, the plan talked about forming a special district for street lighting in the Village of Altmar and a sidewalk district in the Village of Altmar and expanding the town's district for fire protection to include the donut hole that is the village once the village dissolves. Well, now there's a discussion and the residents who, a small majority voted for the dissolution of the village, they don't want to form a sidewalk district. They don't want to form a street lighting district. And the question is, well, does the plan govern that? In my opinion, those districts, even though the plan called for it, those districts must still be formed pursuant to the provisions and the procedures set forth in town law. And the reason being is because it's a completely different process and issue. Also, as a general rule, and there's a different standard as well, when you form districts, state law requires that as a general rule, all the property within a district be benefited by the service or improvement, and that no property outside of the district benefit from the service or improvement, right? It's really a fairness or equity issue. Special districts are a little bit different than village governments, so there's a little different standard for the forming of those. That's why, in my opinion, even if the plan were to call for the creation of special districts, they would still have to be formed pursuant to the procedure outlined in town law. That can be done one of two ways. It can be initiated by the town council, or it can be initiated by a petition of the residents. Even if it's initiated by the town council, it's also subject to a referendum by the residents. Okay? Does that answer your question? Yes, ma'am.
So these districts are formed for tasks other than the street maintenance, because that's already mandated,
That's right.
correct?
Certain things, the question is, the districts are for separate things, and we go back here, right? Highway maintenance, that's a townwide expense that's funded out of the taxes that are levied by the town, okay? If you were to look at your town bill, right, the town bill includes both your town taxes. It also should include, now, do you have a contract with the fire district, or did they expand the fire protection district to include the village?
It's a
So-
town district.
So you also have, on your town tax bill, you will see it, you have a separate line for your fire protection district assessment. That's the same thing that will happen with respect to these other services. You'll have your town taxes as a line, you'll have, and actually because you have another village, you would have townwide tax, you would have a town outside of village tax, part-town tax, because you have Rouse's Point. Then you would have fire protection district and any other district that are set out by lines, because those expenses have to be accounted for separately and raised by a separate levy just on those properties that are within the district.
Well, I had another question, but going back, so if the plan is developed and the board approves it, the final plan, and we don't get a petition and it goes through, the town still would have to accept the plan. Is that not correct, or?
No, you're correct. You're correct.
So what's the point?
Well, that's a good question. For everybody, I didn't draft the legislation, right? No, I didn't draft the legislation. It's the nature of the process. Her comment was, okay, we go through this process. We approve to vote, the vote for dissolving the village on the 19th. We develop a plan, it's approved, there's no second vote, or maybe there is a second vote and it gets approved again, like the Villageof Champlain. And then the town doesn't agree to its implementation. What do? Well, you know what you do? You get involved in town politics. That's what you do. You raise your voice. You go to your council members and your supervisor. That's what this process is. This is the democratic process. That actually occurred in Seneca Falls. It is occurring in Altmar now. Because, and again, this goes back to, this is why I think the law is not great. The town should be responsible for developing the plan. But even then, and this is, you have to understand, so you can have town officials that agree to do one thing now. But what happens in local government, in all government here in the United States? We have elections, and the officials who agree to the plan or whatever agreement that you have in place, they get voted out, and somebody else comes in on the platform of, oh, no, you didn't. Right? There is no way we are going to have, and that actually happened in Seneca Falls, right? So the plan called for the creation of a townwide police department, police, a huge expense. At the next election, 6 weeks prior to the actual effective date of the village dissolution, the town supervisor who championed the dissolution of the village was voted out of office. 2 council members who voted for the dissolution of the village got voted out of office in favor of 2 council members who said, oh no, we're not forming a townwide police department. It's the democratic process. But it's what happens all the time. And so that's really what you have to go back to. I think it adds to, unnecessarily, because the law is written so poorly, uncertainty and confusion and complexity in the process. Yes?
I have another question. Going back to the roads, and maybe I misunderstood you, but if the village today decided not to plow our village streets, would the town have to plow them?
No! They're your village streets. The question is, if the village decided not to plow your streets, I don't recommend that, Mayor. You got some brilliant ideas coming over. Woo! The question is, if the village doesn't plow its streets, is the town obligated to plow those? And the answer is no. They are the village's streets. They are the village's responsibility.
But we're paying townwide taxes.
I know, no, don't get me wrong, I'm just joking, all right? Okay?
They're not obligated, but the town comes in. I was on the town board for 8 years.
All right.
When
Well,
there
and that happens.
When there was a flood here, we came in.
Absolutely.
The village couldn't move anything around here. We had the equipment to come in, we came in.
And that's something that has to be taken into consideration,
We're
absolutely.
plugged in this village.
Absolutely.
The town would come in and plow.
Absolutely.
Guaranteed.
And that is shared services, which we
And
share.
absolutely, the
Shared
other comment,
services is because the village can't get along with the town.
what would you say you have to? The comment here was that the shared services are in place, right? That there are agreements. I have a whole database in my office of intermunicipal agreements between villages and towns and all sorts of, because local governments are sharing services. Ironically, to the extent that they're saving money sharing services, when the village dissolves, you're not going to see any efficiencies because they've already been achieved through these shared services. That's another thing that we see all the time. So, I mean, that doesn't mean you shouldn't dissolve, but I just point that out there. That's why we generally don't see a lot of efficiencies from village dissolution. Moving on. Any other questions?
What about water and sewer?
What do you mean, what about water and sewer?
What happens there? The village pays the water and sewer.
Well, you're going to form, a water district and a sewer district are going to be formed. They're town special districts. Geographic boundary lines are going to be drawn. The town is going to come up with a method for financing those operations that are generally come in the form of an assessment that comes, that's placed upon the properties, just as kind of a baseline, a minimum level of assessment. Then also you have a fee that's based upon your amount of usage. And you're going to pay that as a bill. Now, it may come in the form of a water bill. You may also have an assessment that comes on your tax bill annually. Okay? So, frequently, although, things can change, frequently the town takes over and continues as it was before until maybe they start restructuring and do things differently. But the town, as a general rule, is going to maintain and operate the water and the sewer districts. You're going to have they're going to be separate legal entities, though, those districts. Yes?
What happens because the village provides water and sewer to the town also? How does that complicate the issue?
Well, that's a good question. So you have the village right now, then there's a separate water district outside of the village?
Right.
Well, that's a good question, and that brings me actually to this slide, and I'll pay you later for that segue. You can do a couple of different things. Some villages, you just have an expansion of the district, right, to include existing town districts outside. So, perfect example, Village of Altmont. Their proposal was, okay, there is one town-wide fire protection district in the Village of Altmont. And the proposal is to just expand that to include the village. So you still have only one district. But for street lighting, there's only a street lighting district there. I mean, there's street lighting districts in other parts of the town, but none that are right next to the village. So they're going to create an entirely new district. The other thing is, well, you could do one of two things. You could create a new district that abuts the town district, or you could just join it as one, right? Because I'm assuming the town district is right next to yours, no? You have to figure that out. You got to figure out, what are we going to do? That should be addressed by the plan. You should formulate that. One of the things, though, I caution, and I say this, and this is why I have this slide up here, is different communities have different cost structures. One of the benefits of living in a village, right, in addition to the community and the great old homes that you have and the walkable neighborhoods that you have, is that they're relatively efficient. I can give you a ton of studies that show living in a densely populated community like the Village of Champlain is more cost effective than having extremely sprawling residential development in rural areas. Those are very expensive. This is very cost effective. Here, for example, Seneca Falls. The cost of fire protection in Seneca Falls in the village, right, which is a densely populated community of about, I want to say 6,000, is 0.59 per thousand. That's how much it was costing the village to provide fire protection to its residents prior to the village dissolving. The fire district outside of the village, their annual assessment was 1.18 per thousand. That's what we call the mill rate. It was twice as much. Why was it twice as much? Does everybody know? I mean, I've already kind of hinted at this. That's right. You have more people in a smaller area financing that service. I didn't bring it. I frequently pull out a couple of ropes. And I have a rope and I say, this is fire protection. This is 5 miles of fire protection. And I put one person on the end of the rope and another person on the other end of the rope. 5 miles of fire protection. And I pull up the same length of rope and I say, this is fire protection of the village. And I put 20 people on that rope. Same mileage. You have 20 people paying for 5 miles of fire protection and 2 people paying for 5 miles protection. It is a different cost structure. It's one of the things that you need to think about when you're forming districts. Now, they just created this new townwide district. The cost of providing fire protection to the village residents did not change, but their assessment went up from 0.59 to 0.97. Now, this isn't because the village officials, the elected officials, tried to argue against this, but people are like, you're just trying to obstruct the dissolution process. And they said, fine, we're going to see tax savings anyway. But you can see here, there are different cost structures. That's one of the things you need to think about. If we're going to rely on districts to provide our service, what's the most fair way to do this? And I have to say, village dissolution and local government consolidation in the state of New York is not about efficiency. It's about fairness. It's about fairness. And so that's one of the things that you have to consider. Do we form a larger one district, or do we break it up into smaller districts? Do we district the heck out of it? Yes?
So right now, back to the water issue, the village residents are paying less than the town
Right.
for water services.
That's right.
So if we're incorporated in the town, chances are.
Yes. This
increase
is a
in-
constant complaint I hear from residents who live outside. This is so unfair. We're paying more for water. And what would be the response, Donna, our mayor? Hey, if you want to pay the village water, annex into the village, and pay village taxes too. We'll give you that water rate, but come pay our taxes too. Crimea River. Okay? But your point being, what happens? Does it get leveled out? Well, I mean, that needs to be figured out. When you go to a district assessment kind of thing, you could form just your own district and still contract with them, and it'd still be subject to a contract. That can get really complicated. And the question again becomes one of fairness.
But chances are, if they're going to incorporate all of our assets as the town.
We'll talk about assets in a second, all right? So I'm going to move on. All right, so let's jump back a little bit to procedures. So you figure out your plan. On March 19th, assuming you vote to dissolve the village, are you paying attention, little girl? Are you paying attention? You're the youngest attendee I've had at any of my presentations, I have to tell you. Am I being interesting? No? All right. Okay, excellent. So assuming you vote to dissolve the village on March 19th, you have 180 days to develop a plan. Actually, the board has to meet then within 30 days of your election to basically certify the results. And then from then you have 180 days to prepare a plan. I put my little bomb here that this time period is impractical, right? Why is it impractical? As a general rule, most communities, they hire a consultant. You have to gather a lot of information. You have to work with both the village and the town, right? You're herding cats, trying to figure out what we're going to do. What is the town going to agree to? Can you get the town to agree to something or not? Okay, if the town's not going to agree to it, what are we going to do? What's going to be the basis of our plan? That can be a problem if the town doesn't agree to it, because you still have to put a plan together. I got taken to task by a newspaper. I'm not going to name names because I was in the village of Malone back in October, and the town hadn't agreed to form a police department. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. If the town's not going to agree to provide a service, right? What should you assume when you vote or develop a plan? Should you assume that the town's going to provide that service? Or do you assume conservatively that you're not going to have that service? And I said, you know, that's up to you. I would assume conservatively that I'm not going to have that service. I was a fearmonger. Anyhow, not naming names. So this is the time frame for developing study plans that have actually been done, right? Johnson City, that took 22 months. It's not going to take you that long. That was a completely complicated dissolution study. Seneca Falls, they had to deal with police department. So again, 15 months. Lake George is more of a model about what you would be working on. Not as complicated as the other two. Still, they had services about how to figure it out. That still took them 12 months. This is what the law gives you. The law gives you 6 months. It's impractical. If you can get it done, great. I got off the phone today with a gentleman from Tug Hill who works with Altma on this. He said, you know, they rushed themselves getting this dissolution plan done for the 180-day time period. I always tell people, and unfortunately I didn't do a presentation on one, I always tell people, take however long it takes you to develop the plan. If you can't get it done in 180 days, even that's what the statute tells you to do, take longer. If it takes you 210 days, if it takes you 240 days, take the time you need to get it done. Now don't drag your feet because you can get sued and taken to court. Okay, that's actually in the law. Even if it weren't in the law, state law would allow for it, right? It's called an Article 78 proceeding, where people can sue you and seek an order of mandamus compelling you to take action to finish up the plan. But as long as you're doing your due diligence, you're going to be fine, right? If somebody does take you to court, you're going to go to court and judges to say, what's going on? You say, Your Honor, we're doing the best we can, right? We hired a consultant. That took 45 days because we had to comply with the state's competitive bidding laws, and we had to get the money in place, and then we got them together, and they had to compile the information. We had to have hearings, and we had to gather all this information, and we've got a draft now, but we've got another hearing in 3 weeks, and the judge is going to say, come back in 3 months, and we'll deal with it then. Because the judge isn't want to get involved. Take however much time you need to develop a plan right, okay, to get all of your questions answered. You don't want to rush through this because if you decide to dissolve, it's only going to be problematic down the road. And you don't want to kick this can down the road. You want to get all the issues resolved beforehand and not be dealing with them 3 months before the actual dissolution of the village. All right? Things that must be addressed in the dissolution plan. I know this is very small print. It's even smaller on the handout I gave you. I apologize. Though if you need it, I can give it larger print in the law. Certain things are very basic, the type of name of the village, blah, blah, blah. Some of the things, any fiscal estimate of the dissolution cost, that's something you want to think about. Transferring or eliminating positions of public employees. I say this all the time, local governments are not, they don't exist for the purpose of creating jobs. It's not why they exist. They exist to serve the underlying community. Having said that, you want to address as soon as possible what's going to happen with the employees. Because while there's likely to be 1 or 2 layoffs of employees, you're not going to lay off everybody. It's not like the town has people just sitting around that can pick up and do everything that the village does and provide the same level of service. And particularly with respect to your water and sewer infrastructure, I'm assuming you employ people who have experience and maybe credentials regarding the water and sewer maintenance, right? And those people are in high demand by other communities with water and sewer infrastructure. So you want to make it clear, hey, just because the village is dissolving, the town's agreed, they're going to hire them over, right? You want to address that as soon as possible because when people start to look around and say, boy, the village is dissolving, I don't know what my future is going to be, their natural instinct is to start looking for another job. Right? So you want to address that in the plan. You should have, yes?
But the town is not bound to that.
No. The town is not obligated to hire any village employees. Do you have any, do you have any union contracts or anything? Mm-hmm. All right, that's the other thing. The town is not bound by any union contracts. okay? Despite some protestations of unions when this law got passed and there was a lot of talk of dissolution, what have you, union contracts, the town didn't agree to those. When the village goes away, the town's not obligated to those contracts, okay? So they're not obligated to hire those employees, but you're gonna want the town to agree. And actually, we do see when we have village dissolutions, that functions are started to be transferred even prior to the dissolution's effective date, right? So for example, in the Village of Seneca Falls case, even though their dissolution didn't take effect until the end of December 2011, all during that year, the town started taking over providing services, and they started hiring the village employees to do that. All right? Any agreements entered into the town in which the village is situated in order to carry out the dissolution? I talked before about the prohibition against binding future boards. Some agreements are going to be enforceable and some are not. It depends on the nature of the agreement. And so I can't give you a dispositive answer, but even if they're not enforceable, you do want to have those agreements kind of put in place to kind of commit everybody, at least politically, to undertaking certain things, if not legally. Okay? Yes?
What about zoning and planning?
Your zoning laws will continue in effect here within the village for 2 years upon the dissolution of the village. During that time, the town's got to figure out, and it can be a largely, does the town have any zoning now? It probably has, does it have some? Does it have some?
I think it has one.
Well, they're going to have to figure that out. So adopt their own zoning. If they don't have zoning, then they're going to have to create a zoning board of appeals along with the zoning to regulate the village and establish, zoning districts within the village. Sometimes they just adopt what the village has. Sometimes they, for towns that have their own zoning to kind of make them work together, they have to tweak definitions. Sometimes they look and they try to fix some deficiencies they see in the village zoning code. It depends. That's, again, a political process. All right? The manner and the means that the village services will be provided following the village's dissolution. Again, we already talked about this. I'm not going to belabor that anymore, but that has to be in the plan. That's required to be in the plan. The terms for disposing of village's assets and liabilities and indebtedness, okay? So you have your assets and you have your obligations, your debt. What do those include? The village, I'm assuming you've got a village hall, you might have DPW facilities, you have water and sewer infrastructure, you've got trucks, you've got whatever that the village owns. Those are all your assets. Now the plan should identify what happens to those, and it should be fair. Fair. If you have water and sewer infrastructure, it's going to go to the water and sewer district. If you've got a DPW structure that the town wants and is going to use for the village and the town as a whole, then you're going to transfer that to town. It's going to go in and be, under the supervision of the town highway superintendent, right? You don't have to deal with fire department stuff. What's fair? What makes sense? If the town doesn't need it, town doesn't want it, if they're not going to use it, but maybe just sell it, you want to think about selling that before the dissolution and using those proceeds to pay off any debt or obligations that you have. Okay? Now the debt and obligations, let's talk about that for a second. Okay? So I don't know if you have any bonds issued for water or sewer improvements? What do you got?
We know about 650,000.
Okay, for water
And sewer.
and sewer, right? The town's not going to assume those, but that you want to say, hey, that's going to go to the water or sewer district. Does it go to a new one that you create? Does it go to a new larger one that includes part of the town outside of the former village? What's fair? That's what your calculation is. What's fair?
What happens though, Wade, if the town has debt on the water sewer? And
What's fair?
Who decides?
But if they decide.
Well, that's a good question. Who decides? You decide and they decide. But you have to think about this because the districts themselves are subject to referendum requirements. And I mentioned that some agreements are going to be enforceable and some are not. Those types of agreements, in my opinion, will be enforceable. Okay? And the reason being is because it goes to an issue of equity and fairness with respect to the fiscal operations of both the village and the districts and the town. Okay? But a question, again, what's fair is what we have to figure out. And it can get complicated because they've got their own debt for that district that exists out there. You've been charging them more because they're an outside user. All right? Do we maintain one district or do we maintain those two separate water districts? And in which case, all right, we'll take on all the debt just for our district, but we're going to continue to keep charging you more. And you're still responsible for your own debt. I don't know. Or maybe do we form just one water and sewer district and we all should combine our debt as well? Share our debt.
What do you mean?
That's up to you.
What do you mean, we? If there's no more bills.
Well, not me.
What's that?
I mean we as in we, the water and sewer users. Both inside and outside the former
But you
village.
suggested there might be two districts.
Maybe.
One left behind.
Maybe.
Who's gonna be in charge of that one district behind?
Well, okay, this is the key. It's the town council that oversees the operation and maintenance of the district.
Oh,
If you have two, they're operating both. I will say, there are really two different kinds of town districts in the state of New York. There are districts that have separate elected boards of commissioners. So, for example, fire districts have separate elected boards of fire district commissioners. Is that what yours is?
yes.
Okay. There are fire protection districts, which is governed by a separate law. There is no separate fire board of fire commissioners, fire district commissioners. It is overseen and operated by the town. Right? Fire districts are with commissioners are fairly common in the state of New York. Some water and sewer districts, some sanitation districts, mostly down on Long Island and out in Erie County, actually have separate boards of commissioners. The vast majority, and they exist because of laws that have now been repealed since the 1930s, so they're not created anymore. Any special district, water, sewer, street lighting, sidewalk, garbage, whatever, any of those districts that are created today, they're all operated and overseen by the town councils in which those districts are located. So the town, you may have 10 separate water districts within the town of Champlain. They're all overseen and operated by the town council. They may have separate capacities and operations and infrastructure, and separate levies as well to pay for those. They're not combined. Okay? You have to decide, that's what I'm saying, what works best for you.
So they could take, if they have debt in their town district, once they take over the village.
This is what you're saying, they could take and they could combine that and
Yeah.
force it on us? No. This is why I think, in my opinion, and this is a little bit, apparently I have a different opinion than some people in the state, from the conversation I had today regarding the village of Baltimore. In my opinion, the districts have to be established separately from the approval of the village dissolution plan. In the creation of the districts, the law will govern. And actually, the office of the state comptroller could potentially come in and say, no, you can't do this because it's not equitable or fair. Right? You can't force upon these other property owners an expense for which they have not benefited. Okay? Don't panic though. I want to encourage you, you can have this parade of what ifs. Oh my God, this is going to happen, it's going to be terrible, it's going to be the end of days here in the village of Champlain because we're going to have 1,000 districts and all these expenses foisted on us by the town. Don't go crazy thinking about the what ifs. Right? Right? I'm just saying the process will be to figure out what is fair. And generally that happens. say, you know, this is right. Not always, because sometimes people don't understand, and it's important to understand what's going on. It's important to have all the information gathered. Okay? So, but you have to figure out what's fair. They've got debt, we've got debt. They've got a different cost structure than we do, because we're a more densely populated area. Do we combine our debts? Do we combine the districts and have one levy that's a uniform rate? Or do we keep the separate districts? And if so, then we contract with them to provide a service. What's that rate going to be? They keep their debt? I don't know. You're going to have to figure that out.
But they can combine their debt with the village and.
No. Why? No. Why? Why are you saying? I didn't say that. I said obviously not. Did I say that?
It sounds like that they can.
They heard me back there. They're way back there. Right? No, they can't foist it upon you. This is the other thing. Town special districts are subject to referenda requirements. So, you know, I want to impress upon you, it's not as if they're just going to completely be able to come and run roughshod over you, right? And foist these upon you. I mean, they're having this problem in Altmont because the town wants to form a district, and the residents are saying, no, we're going to referendum this. Okay? So this has to be addressed. Liabilities have to be addressed as well. You have to figure out, again, what's fair. Do you have any other debt besides the water and sewer? Again, generally all those water and sewer goes to water and sewer. Any general debt? Okay. To the extent that you do have general debt, that's just a general obligation on the village, if that's not paid off before the village dissolves, the town will and can form a special debt district to levy an assessment on the properties within the former village, after the village dissolves, to pay off any outstanding debt. And this even occurs if for some reason debt were to arise because of a village obligation. So let's say the village dissolves at the end of this year. I'm just making a date, that would be too soon. But let's say they dissolve at the end of this year, and then next year, next March of 2014, somebody comes in and files a lawsuit because of some negligence that the village incurred, right? You know, that is a village obligation. You get sued, you lose. The town's actually going to be the one that gets sued and loses, but they're going to be able to put that back on just the village properties, right? So it's just a legal construct to hold the village residents liable for your actions as a village. I don't know if you have any legacy costs from any of your union contracts. That's something to consider, whether or not, do you have any post-employment health benefits that are in the contract? Okay, that makes life easier. That was a big issue in St. Paul's. All right, so you have to address that in the plan. What happens to your assets and liabilities to the extent that, you know, the town doesn't need, or, you know, if the town just wants you to give them an asset, you have to think about this as well. Who paid for those assets? Only village residents. So only village residents paid for these assets, and we're just going to give them over to the town to be used by everybody in the town. Is that fair? It's a question to ask, right? Should we get something in return? Should you know, the town may not be very sympathetic again because of the prospect of, well, your taxes are going to go down and our taxes are going to go up. And, you know, my response to them is, well, we've been subsidizing your taxes for 100 years. Give us a break, man. Right? But that's what happens. All right? What else here? So that's it. The plan goes into effect unless a second petition is filed. Right? We've already talked about this. I just want to make clear. The plan goes into effect automatically unless a second petition is filed within 45 days of the plan being approved by the board. It's a 25% threshold again, not the 10% that was needed to initiate the process. I've already showed you this slide again, the sources of savings from villages. I put out here too, this is where I ended, because clearly we are in tough financial times in this state, in this country, but in this state. Local government taxes are high, school district taxes are high. we in Albany, we speak about unfunded mandates. That may not make much sense to you, but when we say the state imposes unfunded mandates, it means they adopt laws that cost you, the taxpayer, money, but the state doesn't pay. Right? They're basically imposing a real property tax on you, but they don't have to take the heat for it. Your mayor and your board of trustees and the town supervisor and the town council, they are the ones who take the heat for it. I often say, instead of calling it unfunded mandates, we should call it mandated real property taxes. That's what we should call it. So it's clear this is what they're doing. There are a ton of unfunded mandates that make it very expensive for local governments to provide services to you. In addition, we have relatively limited revenue streams for local governments. And what do I mean by that? I mean the primary source for revenues for local governments and school districts is the real property tax. Now, there's some benefit to that, because real property is always there. But it can hurt, right? It can drive people and businesses away, and it's very difficult. It's in some respects regressive. Other states, they have a very diversified manner of funding local governments. They use maybe some real property tax. They have a lot more state aid that they give to local governments. They have sales tax, a lot more sales tax that they give. Sometimes income tax. You say, well, gosh, that's a lot of taxes. But it helps to diversify the revenue stream, which is very beneficial and healthy for communities. I put that out there. So we have all these mandates. It is very expensive to live in the state of New York. There is no doubt about it. We are one of the most expensive states in the country when it comes to state and local taxation. Having said that, your village and town and county taxes are a small percentage of your total taxes. School districts are the lion's share. They increase dramatically more than local government. So, you just have to keep that in mind. A lot of people think, oh, if we get rid of the village or if we even consolidate town, oh, we're gonna have this massive tax relief. And the answer to that is unfortunately no. I encourage you also to be involved in your school budget process, which is going on right now, because it's the same thing. They're driving businesses and residents out of your communities. It's part of the problem. What are some of the other options to save money? Well, one is shared services. Unfortunately, most communities have been sharing services already. I mean, maybe there's some more that they can do, but again, I have a database in my office of intermunicipal agreements, many recent ones, some going back decades, where communities have been working together to keep costs down and save you money. This is not new, but it's some place to look for cost savings. It's not going to be a lot, it's not going to be a ton, because it's not as if there's a huge economies of scale. Villages and towns are generally relatively efficient. Village annexation, why do I put that out there? We talked a little bit about those parts of the property just outside the village. This is a problem both for villages and cities. In some states, they don't allow local governments to provide services outside of their boundaries. Right? So in some states, you wouldn't be able to contract or provide water or sewer outside of the boundaries. And they do that to force what I call organic or natural growth of local government boundaries. We do not have that in the state of New York. And so what that has created a free rider problem, right? This is another economic term. We go back to Economic 101. Free riders are those people who get the benefit of an activity undertaken and paid for by somebody else. Right? So people who live just outside of the village get the benefit of the village's existence without having to pay all of the expenses. This is also a problem for cities. Big problem for cities. If you go down to Plattsburgh, you look at where's all the new development. It's outside of the city. It's in the town. The city provides water and sewer as part of there. But the city's also saddled with all the tax-exempt property. The hospital, the university, right? Churches, facilities. So that's a huge problem. And that's a way. If you annex some property into your village, boy, that is similar, right? They're using water and sewer. They're just on the edge. They're part of this community. It would help your tax base as village residents. Now, are they going to be happy about that? They would have to agree to that. Annexation doesn't happen a lot in New York State because This is another thing people don't realize. They say, I live in the incorporated village of Champlain. Yes, you live in the incorporated village of Champlain. But everybody lives in some incorporated part of New York, because there is not one part of New York that is not incorporated. And by that I mean there is not one part of New York that does not have a general purpose local government entity. Everybody lives in either a town or a city or a village and a town. You can't not live in it. And towns are general purpose local government entities. They have home rule. And so we don't change boundaries without having a fight. If the village wants to expand and annex, it's gotta deal with the town. If one town wants to change its boundaries, maybe expand, it's gotta fight with the neighboring town. If the city wants to expand into towns outside of its boundaries, it has a fight. And we are one of the most backwards in the terms of having our local governments grow their boundaries naturally over particularly the past 70 years. Post-World War II, when we had the proliferation of the modern highway system, of any state in the country. And it is very unhealthy for our villages and cities, very unhealthy. It's another reason why I say New York hates cities and villages, because it doesn't allow them to grow their boundaries in a healthy way. All right? So annexation. Coterminous town-village. I basically said there's no way you could charter the village as a city. The city hasn't done that. You could try and become your own town, a town within the town, and this actually has come up, and it comes up all the time. The village of Norwood, near Potsdam. When Potsdam considered dissolution last year, they considered this because the village of Norwood's taxes were going to go sky high should the village of Potsdam dissolve. But they said, well, this isn't fair. Nothing's changing here, but our taxes are going to go up even more. So they looked into becoming their own coterminous town village. And what is the benefit of that? They're no longer paying town taxes. Now you also have a cost, because then you would have to have a justice court, and you would have to think about other things like how do you take on some of those other expenses. We have 5 coterminous town villages in the state of New York, but that's the benefit there. Consolidation of the towns with neighboring towns. That's the one instance where everybody's likely to see their taxes go down. But again, you have the herding cats problem, and we already had the one scenario where the town that was going to see its taxes go down 50% voted it down. But the reason I put it out there, that is the one instance where everybody's taxes are likely to go down. And you don't get the creation of any districts. There's no need for the creation of any new districts. You can keep exactly the same districts you had before. So we reduce the number of local government entities, everybody's taxes go down. I put that out there. That's another thing. Look at exempting the village from the taxes, some of the town taxes. There are some discretionary town taxes. It's a little complicated. I can provide some information to you, Don, if you're interested in that. There are some optional taxes that the town can say, okay, we're going to put these as a town outside of the village. And I don't know whether the town's doing that now. You can look in, you can but it's not mandatory. You'd have to go and you'd have to petition the council and the supervisor to do that. And of course, if you do that, you're raising the taxes of the residents in the town outside of the village. So that's a political decision they need to make. And finally, discontinuing services. If you're going to do that as part of dissolution, you can do that now without dissolving the village. You could get rid of your street lights now without dissolving the village. If the town's not going to take it on and you don't want to form a district, you could get rid of street lights. If you want to get rid of your brush and leaf pickup, you could do that now without dissolving the village. So those are just some of the other options. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Should this village of Champlain dissolve, would that automatically mean that the residents in the Rouse's Point village taxes will go up?
Well, that's a good question. The question is what's going to be the fiscal impact upon the residents in the town of Rouse's Point? Well, Rouse's Point, those residents, just like you're paying village taxes plus town-wide taxes, right? Rouse's Point, they're paying Village of Rouse's Point taxes and town-wide taxes. If you dissolve the Village of Champlain, the town now becomes responsible for plowing your streets and maintaining your streets. That comes out of as a general rule, the town-wide highway fund, which the Village of Rouse's Point residents also pay, town-wide highway fund. In addition, your subsidizing of the town budget goes away, so town taxes go up, the town-wide taxes go up. They're still paying those town-wide taxes, so their taxes are likely to go up. That's what happened in the Village of Potsdam dissolution context. Just like the taxes, all the residents who live outside of the Village of Champlain, whether they're in or outside of the Village of Rouse's Point, they're likely to see their taxes go up. I've not seen either a study or an actual village dissolution where taxes of residents outside of the village either were projected to go up in the study or actually went up with the village dissolved. I've never seen it. If somebody knows of it, please email me, wade@nicom.org. Yes?
The gentleman that came last time, he had stated that there's a very strict timeline for everything. And he said that in order to do the referendum, you only would have it at 45 days.
Yes.
Okay. You just implied earlier that there's a timeline for the study is 180
Yes.
days. But take your time, extend that out, and
Yes.
so forth. So how would you know when your 45 days
No,
would be
The
required?
45 days are the 45 days. You don't get to take your time with the 45 days.
So you're 40 at 100 before the 180 days.
No. The 45 days starts to run from the date when the board approves the dissolution plan. So if the board takes 180 days, or if they take 100 days and they approve the dissolution plan, from the date they approve the dissolution plan, and I skipped over some things. There's hearings that are required, okay? They have to have a public hearing, and they're going to have other workshops and stuff in addition to the official public hearing. But from the date where they finally adopt the final plan, that's the date from which you calculate the 45 days. So it can move, but that 45-day period, all you're ever going to get is 45 days. Okay? I say take your time in putting the study together. I mean, you may be able to get it done in 180 days. But it may take 200 days. I mean, you're going to go into the summer, people are going to be on vacation, blah, blah, blah. If it takes 210 days, it takes 210 days, and then they finally approve it, that's when the clock starts ticking. All right? But you don't get any leeway on that 45 days. I'm fairly cavalier about the 180 days, right? But not the 45. Any other questions? I know I've kept you here 2 hours. That's about what I do. Yes, sir.
I'm going to make a comment to the village board. I made some statements to the Press Republican, and they were quoted properly but like some famous, I won't say her name, I misspoke. I meant because I thought that the yes vote in this upcoming election was a yes to go through pursuing the plan, but not voting for the plan. But I appreciate what the board does. They're hardworking, they have a good staff, and I've always been in favor of their proposals. So it didn't mean my yes vote was yes, I approve the dissolution. The yes was I approve whatever the process was before dissolution.
And that's exactly what you were talking about. How they turned it when you tell you one thing when they go out with a petition. And you think that's what you're voting on, but that's not what you're voting on.
Well, and sometimes, the law is complicated. I think sometimes people don't understand the law themselves when they're circulating a petition, that they really think, okay, this is just a study. Or we've also seen some instances where, in some of the villages, people have encouraged the board to study dissolution because they can do that of their own volition, right? The board can do it of its own accord. So they tried to get the board to do it, and the board's like, we're not really interested. We talked to people, and they're like, okay, they wouldn't do it, and so now I'm going to force them to do it. And this is the only way I can force them to do it. And unfortunately, I'm sympathetic to people who wanted to force the issue because there's really no good way to it now. It forces you to have this vote before you get the plan. I will say, I drafted legislation amending the law that would put the cart back behind the horse, or the horse back in front of the cart. If Our proposed legislation has been introduced in the Senate by Senator Jack Martins and in the Assembly by Assemblywoman Michelle Schimmel. It makes a ton of technical corrections, which I won't bore you with. Only we lawyers who are concerned about this are interested in. But what it does is it raises the threshold up. It doesn't put it back at the third that it was before under Article 19 of the village law. It puts it at 25%. But it requires a study to be done before the vote. And the reason we want the 25% is getting 10% of the residents to sign something is easy, right? And there's confusion, people don't know what they're signing, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. It's not hard at all. And we've seen many of those votes go through, and then they go down. I mean, we've had votes, the village of Middleburg, on February 19th, so 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, whenever it was, they voted on dissolution. There was so much confusion about the process under this new law. They had fewer people actually vote for dissolution than sign the petition. How can that be? And I think it speaks to how messed up the law is. But it's not, again, it's not fair to the democratic process. It's not fair to the people who really want to look at this and want to force the board to do it. But I think you can't leave the number at 10% because it's expensive and time consuming to do these studies. It is all consuming for the village board to do this. And meanwhile, they've got to still prepare the budget and they've still got to deal with infrastructure issues and they've still got to deal with resident complaints. And you got to hire a consultant. And if you're doing that, you're going to be spending a lot of tax dollars which you don't have. Now, there's some study grants out there from the state that you can apply for, and Keysville got that, right? And Lyons has got it now, and Malone, I think, got grant money as well. So it can help, but you still have to match part of that. And so I am sympathetic to the people who circulate these petitions who really just want to study it, right? But I think, having that higher threshold too, I think it puts a little bit of onus on them to make sure that people actually understand what the issue is and requires them to build support. Otherwise, we're just wasting everybody's time. It doesn't do any of these communities any good because we have important things that we need to be looking about. We need to be figuring out how do we deal with these abandoned properties. We need to be thinking about how we revitalize these communities and not wasting our time on these dissolution votes that go down spectacularly. And I don't mean by a small margin. 3 of the 19 have been approved. Of those others, they've been voted against 5-1, 6-1, 4-1. They're not even close because it's not a good process. So, sorry.
You think that it's because of what I just, I'm sorry.
I'm going to go ahead. You've spoken for. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, sir. Sorry, I'll come back to you. And everybody feel free to leave. I'm not. Yes, sir.
When it comes to the issue of voting in villages around New York State, we've done our voting here in March, but you just said another village did voting in February, and I see some here dates of December and so on. How many of the villages that you deal with have done away with that and have gone to voting or do any vote during the November general election?
Let's step back. Separate issues here. The question is about the vote on the dissolution of a village and versus when you normally hold your village election.
Or their general village election where we elect our officials.
Article 17A of the general municipal law sets up this time period so it's a rolling time period. So, Village of Middleburg, their elections are normally in March, the third Tuesday in March, just like Champlain. They had their vote on February 19th because that's when the law required it. It gives them this window of when to hold the vote on whether or not to dissolve the village based upon when the petition is filed. You can file a petition at any time. Okay? Regarding when village elections are held, by state law, and this is this was actually discussed by the Commission on Local Government Efficiency and Competitiveness, which was a state commission dating back to 2006 through 2008. And village elections are, by state law, by default, held on the third Tuesday of March. Villages can, pursuant to state law, change the date of their election. The second most popular date is to have them in the third Tuesday of June, and many villages actually have put them in November. So we have quite a few villages that actually have their elections for the village offices. When you normally hold your village election to elect your mayor, your trustees, and your justice if you have a justice court, okay? We even have some villages that have their elections in May, don't ask me. Why then as opposed to November? Well, for a couple of reasons. And I'll point out too, fire districts, they have their elections in,
December.
do you vote?
Sure.
Okay. Does everybody else? Everybody else here, I say no because they didn't know when it was. They're in December. Winter school elections, the school elections are May. So the commission looked at it and said, why don't we, gotta consult, let's put everybody in November. Right? That'll be efficient. I can tell you the county boards of elections do not want everybody voting on all these offices in November. Because you would have ballots that were multi-pages, right? And people think elections are easy issues, right? They think Florida is all messed up. Why? How can they screw that up? Elections are not easy. If we put all of our elections, both state and local elections, in one date, you would have ballot upon ballot upon ballot upon ballot. And instead of filling out one electron scan ballot or two sides, you would potentially have 3 or 4 that you would have to fill out. And that's a problem for conducting an election, okay? The other thing is if you move your village elections to November, by default they become partisan elections automatically, meaning they're Republicans and Democrats. Do you have Republicans and Democrats now here? Right now, in the vast majority of villages that have their elections in March and June, and the few that have them in May, their elections, while the Republicans and Democrats and working families and whatever party, as that term is defined in state law, a party is defined for purposes of getting your party candidate on the ballot as any party whose candidate for governor at the previous gubernatorial election received at least 50,000 votes, okay? And we only have 6 of those right now. They can put their candidates on the village election ballots. As a general rule, they don't. Most of the village elections, you get on the ballot by circulating what's called an independent nominating petition. So you have independent bodies. And the beauty of that for village elections is it allows issues that are relevant to the village to be discussed and talked about during the election. Because what is the local government platform for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? What are their issues on the village water system, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Working Family Party? And the answer is they don't have local platforms, okay? But if you turn local elections into partisan elections, then people go in and what are they going to vote on? I know what party I am. I don't know, I didn't have to learn about anything. Oh, you're more likely just to elect Republicans and Democrats. And so in some respects, that's not actually even democratic at the local level because it's not really an informed vote. You're electing people based upon their party identity, which is all based upon state and federal issues, not local issues. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I'm taking this opportunity.
You brought up a good point, Phil. My only angle was, not to interrupt you, was that I had heard of some other villages that changed it only because they said their voter turnout became much better.
Absolutely.
Perhaps it
that is one of the things. Clearly, if you put your office for elections and your village offices in November, you're going to have more people voting because people turn out. They turn out to vote for president, or they turn out to vote for governor. They turn out to vote for those, and town offices as well. It's the natural, I know it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That's the general election date. You get higher voter turnout, absolutely.
But you brought up a very
You have to weigh that against having an informed vote. And that's really what we argue. It's up to you. You can, and if you want to change it, we help villages all the time switch to November elections. It can be a cost savings issue. The proposal, there was a proposal to put everybody in November elections, and frankly, again, the counties don't want to deal with that because it would be a logistical nightmare for them. It's really difficult because there are villages that are more than one county or more than one town. That becomes a whole separate issue. That's not an issue for you. One of the proposals that came up from the Commission on Local Government Efficiency and Competitiveness was well, let's have 2 dates then. We'll have the November date, and then we'll have 1 date in May. So we'll put the fire districts and the villages and the school districts in May, or something like that. So we do get a little bit of an efficiency. That's potentially one proposal. You know, it hasn't gone anywhere. You would get more turnout then as well. But again, you probably then get partisan representation at those elections as well, because they become so important that people would be running as Republican and Democrat. And that's actually what we see at the school board elections, is people running as Republican and Democrat. So, completely not related to village dissolution. Although, frankly, it is in some respects related to village dissolution, because when a village dissolves, you may have independent parties, but the town governments, as a general rule, are partisan, right? So you may have a community that is concerned on one issue or whatever, may be by its very nature Democrat or Republican, but the town as a whole is not. And so it can change who gets elected as a general rule within your community. So it's something to consider. It goes back to, can having the town represent you, is it going to be democratic? Is it going to represent you, who you are as a community? So, and not totally waste of time. I'm sorry, not waste of time. That was a great question. I get interested in these issues. As you can see, I knew a little bit about that topic. So, go ahead.
All I wanted to say was, after working for the village for 12 years and doing elections every year, when there's an issue that the residents are really concerned about, they come out en masse. Normally, we don't have a lot of people, because my assumption is people are happy with what we're doing. And we've got more people tonight than we've had in probably the last 5 elections. So if this is an indication, I think we'll have a good turnout.
Well, regardless of what you do, I can't encourage you enough. People need to get involved. Not just at the village level. You need to get involved with the town. You need to get involved in the school districts. If you're not paying attention, I can tell you, I mean, we represent cities and villages, and there's been talk of cities and villages having fiscal distress and problems and potential municipal bankruptcy. But the schools, it is going to be brutal this year. Statewide. You need to be in touch with your state elected officials. Because the system that the state has created is finally toppling and crumbling. And part of it's due, so it's because of our recession. No, I think it's been accelerated because of the recession. But I think we would have been where we are if we had not had a recession, probably 10 years from now. Simply because of the unfunded mandates. I mean, we are seeing local governments and school districts, they're cutting to the bone, right? Well, we got to cut, we got to trim here and there. Well, there's no more fat to trim. People are stopping providing service. I mean, we're having municipalities who are, stopping providing fire protection and police protection, who in the past was never thought about that, but it's just unsustainable. You see school districts that can't provide their basic courses or classes to their students. And well, again, schools and municipalities provide different services. The issue is really the same. The state is not adequately addressing unfunded mandates. And even if you dissolve the village, the town's still subject to the same unfunded mandates as the villages and cities and counties. So get involved. Come to your meetings. Run for office. I'm not saying I don't mean it that way. But you know what? People have to get involved, and it's a struggle. I'm not an elected official. I say oftentimes too, we had this discussion a little bit before for those when I was here early. In some respects, village government is an efficiency. Because once every 2 years, you get to, am I happy with what's going on? Yes. Okay, I'm going to re-elect you. If I'm not, you didn't address this issue, okay, we're going to put somebody back in. And you don't have to spend a lot of time on this. You get to have your voice and have your say and have that government be responsive. And the question is whether or not, you're going to get that at the town level as well. So, if you are, then I'd wager money, I can't tell you what it's going to be, but the village residents will see their taxes go down should the village dissolve. All right? Any other questions? Yes?
there was a statement made earlier, and you seemed a little bit startled by it, when we were talking about, taxes for the town. And you thought our town taxes would be, our village taxes would be
Oh,
higher
the
than
fact that you
town
pay more in
taxes.
town taxes,
Yes,
um,
that concerned me, on 2 levels.
Well, I
One,
don't-
The village is
to
doing
be
a
honest,
really good
I-
job.
I'm not familiar with the town operations or the town budget, all right? So, and it all varies, I'm not aware of what services the town provides for you. I mean, it can be that town cost structures, just by their very nature, are more expensive. I'll give you an example, the Village of Odessa, which considered dissolving back in 2010, October, with the supervisor who, developed the plan ahead of time. It was gonna take him 2.5 employees to do what the village was doing with 1.5 employees to plow the street. And part of that just had to do with his labor contracts and his labor costs. And it was gonna actually cost him $130,000 more to maintain the streets, more than what the village was paying to maintain the streets. Okay? They had different cost structures. Now, it could be, I don't know what the town is as far as services, is providing for the village, and, or townwide. I mean, it could be, we have some villages, some towns, pardon me, that are more like cities, in that they have police departments. And they have extensive infrastructure and extensive services that they provide, not via districts, but on a townwide basis. So I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what the roads are in the town, because those are generally all out of the town's general fund, right? You have to look at that and see what's going on. Some expenses, though, and this is why it's important to be knowledgeable about the town budget. And I can tell you, there was just a case down in the Hudson Valley where I mentioned how certain things are supposed to be town outside of the village. One thing, do you do code enforcement here? You have your own code enforcement and you have your own zoning. So you have your own code enforcement and your own zoning. All of the town's code enforcement and zoning, that needs to be a town outside of village expense, including attorney's fees and things like that, right? Well, a town down in downstate New York was not allocating attorney's fees and even legal judgments that it incurred as a result of zoning violations, town outside of village. It put it town-wide, right? And they had a substantial legal judgment. Like, I think it was like $1 million or something, that the town lost because of its zone. Well, the village had its own zoning, but they applied that town-wide. It should have been town outside of village. Well, the village residents sued. The court said, yep, that's wrong. You gotta put all of that town outside of village. So to the extent that the village residents paid that, they got a reimbursement, the town had to give back in taxes. You gotta make sure that the town is allocating in its budget correctly. Now, it may be doing that and still the expenses are what they are. I don't know.
I think I just inferred from your response that in general, it's the other way around.
Well,
So,
no, it depends. It depends on a variety of circumstances. Everything's different. I just assume the town here is a it's a rural town, right, outside of Rouse's Point and Champlain. Maybe that speaks to, frankly, how efficient the village is in operation of the village operations and budget. That's something to say for the village and not necessarily against the town. I don't know. But if you look at, okay, what does the town do? As far as its services, it's got a town justice court. I don't know how much revenue it raises from that too. It should be getting revenues from any of the speeding tickets on the Northway that come down and get fled down to something else. I don't know. So those revenues should go in to offset the town justice court expenses. I'd have to look at it to see, but I just looked at it and said, it's a rural town, what services is it providing? It's providing highway, it's got its general functions, you're paying for the salaries of the supervisors and the elected officials in the council. I'm trying to think of other expenses it has, the justice court, does it have rec programs or parks that are townwide? Okay, so if it's got those, you know, those can be substantial, I don't, you know, and then, you know, they're something that you can take advantage of as a village resident.
I'm sure they provide a lot of services, I was just, I think, surprised by your reaction to it.
Well, I have to look at it. Most of them, when I see, I mean, so for example, you know, I've seen some communities where, you know, as a general rule, the village is providing more services than the town does. And so, as a general rule, you're paying more in taxes because you're getting more services, right? The town taxes, they're, to the extent that they have street lighting districts outside of villages, right? Is that what it is? That's not something that goes into the town tax. No? Do they not? But that's, my point being, for example, right? So, for many of the services that you provide here in the village, generally the towns are not providing those on a townwide basis. They're providing those expenses on a district